Before Alexander, there was a kingdom born of shadows. From the rugged highlands north of Mount Olympus, scattered tribes slowly forged a power that would one day conquer the world. At its heart was the Argead dynasty, claiming divine bloodlines and a destiny written in legend. But who was Perdiccas I, the mysterious founder whose very existence blurs the line between myth and history? And how did three exiled brothers from Argos ignite the rise of a kingdom that would give birth to Alexander the Great? The story begins long before the man became a legend. This is the origin of Macedon. The youngest, Perdiccas, eventually established his own kingdom after interpreting a divine sign involving the sun's rays entering a house through a smoke hole. While this narrative bears the hallmarks of dynastic mythology designed to legitimize royal authority, archaeological evidence suggests that Greek-speaking peoples did indeed migrate northward during the 8th and 7th centuries BC, gradually establishing dominance over the existing Thracian and Illyrian populations. The early Argead rulers faced the monumental task of unifying disparate tribal groups scattered across a landscape that ranged from fertile river valleys to forbidding mountain ranges. Perdiccas I and his immediate successors operated from the ancient capital of Argead, modern-day Vergina, strategically positioned in the Pyrenean foothills where they could control access routes between the coastal plains and the highland pastures. The kingdom's early expansion followed the natural geography of the region, with successive rulers extending their authority along the Haliacmon and Axios river systems while establishing fortified positions at key mountain passes. The Macedonian homeland presented both extraordinary opportunities and formidable challenges for its rulers. The kingdom's northern and western borders abutted the territories of various Illyrian tribes, fierce warriors who regularly launched raids into Macedonian territory and posed a constant military threat. To the east lay Thrace, with its own complex tribal confederations and established trade networks. However, Macedonia's position also provided crucial advantages that astute rulers could exploit. The kingdom controlled several vital mountain passes, including the routes through the Apindus Mountains that connected the Adriatic coast with the Aegean and the passes leading from Thessaly into the northern Balkans. Perhaps most significantly, Macedonia's coastal territories provided access to the lucrative trade networks of the northern Aegean. The kingdom's ports, particularly Pydna and later Amphipolis, became essential waypoints for merchants transporting goods between the Black Sea colonies and the Greek mainland. The region's abundant natural resources, including timber from the extensive forests, precious metals from mountain mines, and fertile agricultural land, provided the economic foundation necessary to support an increasingly sophisticated state apparatus. The social and military structure that emerged in Macedonia differed markedly from the polis system that characterized southern Greece. While Greek city-states developed around urban centers with citizen assemblies and complex constitutional arrangements, Macedonia remained fundamentally a tribal monarchy, where personal loyalty to the king superseded abstract concepts of citizenship. The Macedonian nobility, known as the hetairoi or companions, formed the backbone of both the kingdom's military forces and its administrative structure. The hetairoi represented a unique fusion of Greek aristocratic ideals and indigenous Macedonian traditions. Unlike the citizen soldiers of southern Greek city-states, who typically fought as heavily armored hoplites in tight formations, the Macedonian companions evolved into an elite cavalry force that would eventually become the most feared mounted unit in the ancient world. The development of the companion cavalry reflected both the kingdom's pastoral traditions and the practical requirements of warfare in the Macedonian highlands, where mobility often proved more valuable than the disciplined but inflexible phalanx formations favored by southern Greeks. The early companion cavalry rode sturdy horses bred in the highland pastures, animals capable of carrying armored riders across varied terrain while maintaining the speed and maneuverability necessary for effective cavalry operations. The companions fought with long spears, swords, and small shields, developing tactics that emphasized shock action and rapid pursuit rather than the grinding attrition warfare typical of hoplite battles. This military innovation reflected broader changes in Macedonian society, as the kingdom's rulers increasingly relied on personal bonds of loyalty and military prowess rather than the legal and political structures that governed southern Greek communities. The Macedonian infantry, drawn primarily from the kingdom's free peasantry, also developed along different lines than their southern counterparts, while maintaining some elements of traditional hoplite equipment and tactics. Macedonian foot soldiers gradually adopted longer spears and more flexible formations that could operate effectively in the varied terrain of their homeland. The famous sarissa, the exceptionally long pike that would later dominate Hellenistic battlefields, likely evolved from these early experiments with extended spear lengths designed to give Macedonian infantry advantages in both offensive and defensive operations. The Persian Wars of the early 5th century BCE presented the Macedonian kingdom with both unprecedented opportunities and existential dangers. When Darius I launched his expedition against the Scythians around 513 BC, Macedonian territory lay directly in the path of the Persian advance. Alexander I, who ruled Macedonia from approximately 498 to 454 BCE, demonstrated the diplomatic acumen that would become a hallmark of Argead statecraft by submitting to Persian authority while simultaneously maintaining connections with the Greek world. Alexander the Seer's position during the Persian Wars exemplified the delicate balance that Macedonian rulers had to maintain between competing powers and cultural identities. When Xerxes assembled his massive invasion force in 480 BCE, Macedonia served as a crucial staging area for Persian operations against southern Greece. Alexander I provided the Persian king with supplies, guides, and military support, fulfilling his obligations as a Persian vassal while secretly maintaining communication with Greek resistance forces. The Macedonian king's most famous act of covert assistance to the Greek cause occurred before the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, when he allegedly warned the Athenian commanders of Persian battle plans. This episode, recorded by Herodotus, illustrates the complex loyalties and calculated risks that characterized Macedonian foreign policy during this period. Alexander III could not openly defy Persian authority without inviting devastating retaliation against his kingdom. Yet he recognized that a complete Persian victory would likely result in the permanent subjugation of all Greek-speaking peoples. The aftermath of the Persian Wars created new opportunities for Macedonian expansion and consolidation. As Persian power retreated from Europe and the Greek city-states became embroiled in their own conflicts, Alexander III moved to strengthen his kingdom's position in the northern Aegean. He expanded Macedonian territory eastward, gaining control of silver mines that would provide crucial revenue for his successors. The king also initiated a policy of selective Hellenization, inviting Greek artists, poets, and intellectuals to his court, while maintaining the traditional Macedonian social structure. Alexander III's participation in the Olympic Games, where he competed in the foot race after proving his Greek ancestry to skeptical officials, symbolized Macedonia's ambiguous position between the Greek and barbarian worlds. The Macedonian nobility increasingly adopted Greek cultural practices, including the symposium tradition and Greek artistic styles, while retaining their distinctive military traditions and monarchical government. This cultural synthesis would prove crucial to Macedonia's later expansion, as it allowed Macedonian rulers to present themselves as legitimate leaders of the Greek world, while maintaining the military and political structures necessary to control their diverse kingdom. The reigns of Alexander III's successors, particularly Perdiccas II and Argead I, witnessed continued efforts to strengthen Macedonia's position through careful diplomacy and internal reforms. Perdiccas II navigated the complex politics of the Peloponnesian War, alternately supporting Athens and Sparta as circumstances dictated, while avoiding commitments that might expose Macedonia to devastating retaliation. His reign demonstrated the growing sophistication of Macedonian statecraft, as the kingdom began to play an increasingly important role in the broader Greek world without sacrificing its independence or core interests. Argead I, who ruled from 413 to 399 BCE, implemented significant internal reforms that modernized the Macedonian state and military. He constructed new roads and fortifications, reorganized the kingdom's administrative structure, and continued the process of military innovation that would reach its culmination under Philip II. Argead also moved the royal capital from Argead to Pella, a decision that reflected Macedonia's growing orientation toward the Aegean world and its expanding commercial interests. The new capital at Pella, situated in the fertile plains near the Thermaic Gulf, represented a dramatic departure from the traditional highland strongholds of earlier Argead rulers. The city's location provided better access to maritime trade routes, while offering defensive advantages through its position on elevated ground, surrounded by marshes and rivers. Argead commissioned Greek architects and artists to design and decorate his new capital, creating an urban center that rivaled the great cities of southern Greece in both scale and sophistication. The assassination of Perdiccas III at the hands of Illyrian raiders in 359 BC plunged Macedonia into the most severe crisis of its existence. 4,000 Macedonian soldiers lay dead alongside their king. The kingdom's borders faced simultaneous invasions from multiple directions, and rival claimants to the throne threatened to tear the realm apart from within. Into this chaos stepped Philip II, initially serving as regent for his infant nephew Amyntas IV, but the 23-year-old prince possessed both the vision and ruthless pragmatism necessary to transform Macedonia from a beleaguered frontier kingdom into the dominant military power of the Greek world. Philip's early years had prepared him uniquely for the challenges he now faced. His 3-year captivity in Thebes as a political hostage from 368 to 365 BCE had provided him with unprecedented exposure to the most advanced military innovations of his era. Under the tutelage of Epaminondas and Pelopidas, Philip observed firsthand the revolutionary tactics that had shattered Spartan hegemony at Leuctra and Mantinea. The sacred band's disciplined formations, the innovative use of oblique order tactics, and the integration of different military units into coordinated battlefield systems would all influence Philip's later military reforms. The immediate threats facing Macedonia in 359 BCE demanded swift and decisive action. Bardilas, the Illyrian king who had killed Perdiccas III, controlled vast territories in western Macedonia and showed no inclination to halt his expansion. Thracian tribes pressed against Macedonia's eastern borders, while the Paeonians launched raids from the north. Perhaps most dangerously, several pretenders to the Macedonian throne had secured foreign backing for their claims. Pausanias enjoyed Thracian support, while Argead had gained Athenian backing and actually landed at Methone with a force of mercenaries. Philip's response to these multiple crises revealed the strategic acumen that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than attempting to confront all enemies simultaneously, he employed a combination of diplomacy, bribery, and carefully timed military action to isolate and defeat his opponents individually. He bought off the Paeonians with tribute payments and convinced the Thracians to withdraw their support from Pausanias through a mixture of diplomatic overtures and strategic concessions. The Athenian-backed expedition of Argead proved easier to handle militarily, as Philip's forces defeated the pretender's mercenary army near Methone and captured many of the survivors. The young regent's treatment of these Athenian prisoners demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of interstate politics. Rather than demanding ransoms or executing the captives, Philip released them without payment and returned their equipment, a gesture calculated to improve relations with Athens while demonstrating Macedonia's growing strength and confidence. This diplomatic masterstroke helped neutralize Athenian hostility at a crucial moment when Philip needed to focus his attention on more immediate military threats. The transformation of the Macedonian military system began almost immediately after Philip consolidated his position as king. The traditional Macedonian army, while effective in the context of tribal warfare and border raids, proved inadequate for the sustained campaigns and siege operations that Philip envisioned. The existing infantry formations relied heavily on traditional hoplite equipment and tactics, with 8-foot spears, large circular shields, and relatively loose formations that emphasized individual combat prowess over collective discipline. Philip's revolutionary innovation centered on the development of the sarissa, a pike measuring between 18 and 21 feet in length that fundamentally altered the nature of infantry combat. The sarissa's extraordinary length required both hands to wield effectively, necessitating the adoption of smaller, lighter shields that could be strapped to the left arm rather than gripped by hand. This seemingly simple change had profound tactical implications, as formations of sarissa-armed infantry could present multiple rows of spear points to approaching enemies while maintaining much greater reach than traditional hoplite formations. The new Macedonian phalanx typically deployed in formations 16 ranks deep, with the first 5 ranks extending their sarissas forward, while the rear ranks held their weapons vertically to deflect incoming projectiles. This dense forest of spear points created an almost impenetrable barrier against frontal assault, while the phalanx's ability to advance steadily forward made it a formidable offensive weapon. The coordination required for effective sarissa tactics demanded extensive training and discipline, leading Philip to establish permanent training camps where recruits spent months learning to maneuver in formation. The professionalization of the Macedonian army extended far beyond the adoption of new weapons and tactics. Philip introduced regular pay for his soldiers, transforming military service from a seasonal obligation of free citizens into a year-round profession. This innovation allowed for continuous training and campaigning, while attracting recruits from across the Greek world who sought steady employment and the prospect of sharing in the spoils of victory. The king also established a comprehensive system of military ranks and promotions based on merit rather than birth, creating incentives for exceptional performance while ensuring that experienced veterans occupied leadership positions. The integration of siege warfare capabilities represented another crucial element of Philip's military revolution. Traditional Greek warfare had generally avoided prolonged sieges due to their enormous cost and technical difficulties involved in breaching fortified positions. Philip invested heavily in developing sophisticated siege equipment, including torsion catapults, battering rams, and mobile towers that could bring attackers to the level of defensive walls. He recruited engineers and specialists from across the Mediterranean world, creating a core of technical experts capable of reducing even the strongest fortifications. The siege of Amphipolis in 357 BCE demonstrated the effectiveness of Philip's new military system. The city's strategic position, controlling access to the Strymon River Valley and its proximity to the Pangaeum gold mines, made it a crucial target for Macedonian expansion. Traditional siege methods would have required months or years to reduce such a well-fortified position, But Philip's engineers employed innovative tunneling techniques and concentrated artillery bombardment to breach the walls within a matter of weeks. The rapid fall of Amphipolis sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world and established Philip's reputation as a master of siege warfare. The economic transformation that accompanied Philip's military reforms proved equally revolutionary in its scope and impact. The capture of Amphipolis provided access to the legendary Pangaeum gold mines, which had been producing precious metals since the 6th century BCE. Under Philip's administration, these mines reached unprecedented levels of output, generating an estimated annual revenue of over 1,000 talents of gold. This enormous influx of precious metal provided the financial foundation for all of Philip's subsequent military and political initiatives. Philip's approach to managing the Pangaeum mines reflected his broader economic philosophy of systematic exploitation and reinvestment. Rather than simply extracting wealth for immediate consumption, he invested heavily in expanding mining operations, improving extraction techniques, and developing the infrastructure necessary to transport and process raw materials. The king recruited mining engineers from across the Mediterranean world, including specialists from the silver mines of Lauria and Attica, and experts in hydraulic engineering from Egypt and Mesopotamia. The development of comprehensive trade networks represented another crucial component of Philip's economic strategy. Macedonia's position controlling key mountain passes and river valleys provided natural advantages for commercial development, but Philip systematically expanded and improved these capabilities through infrastructure investment and diplomatic agreements. He constructed new roads connecting major population centers, established standardized weights and measures throughout his territories, and negotiated commercial treaties that facilitated trade with Greek cities, Thracian kingdoms, and even distant Persian satrapies. The systematic taxation of conquered territories provided a steady source of revenue that complemented the wealth generated by mining operations. Philip's administrators developed sophisticated assessment methods that took into account local economic conditions, agricultural productivity, and commercial activity. Rather than imposing uniform tribute requirements that might provoke rebellion, the Macedonian system allowed for considerable local variation, while ensuring that subject communities contributed proportionally to the kingdom's military and administrative expenses. The establishment of new cities throughout Philip's expanding territories served multiple strategic purposes while generating additional economic benefits. These urban foundations, typically located at strategic crossroads or defensive positions, provided secure bases for Macedonian garrisons, while creating new centers of commercial activity. Philippi, founded on the site of the Thracian settlement Crinides in 356 BCE, exemplified this approach by combining military necessity with economic opportunity. The city's position near the Pangaea mines ensured effective control over this crucial resource, while its location on major trade routes generated substantial customs revenues. Philip's political consolidation of Macedonia required the elimination of rival claimants and the integration of newly conquered territories into a unified administrative system. The king's treatment of potential rivals demonstrated both ruthless pragmatism and sophisticated political calculation. Rather than simply executing all possible threats, Philip employed a variety of strategies, including marriage alliances, hostage-taking, territorial grants, and selective elimination to neutralize opposition while maintaining stability within the kingdom. The expansion of Macedonia's borders proceeded systematically as Philip's military and economic reforms provided the capabilities necessary for sustained territorial conquest. The subjugation of the Illyrian tribes that had long threatened Macedonia's western frontiers required multiple campaigns between 358 and 355 BCE. Philip's victory over Perdiccas near Lake Offred in 358 BCE eliminated the most serious Illyrian threat while demonstrating the effectiveness of the reformed Macedonian army against traditional tribal forces. The battle showcased the devastating impact of coordinated phalanx and cavalry attacks against less disciplined opponents, with Macedonian casualties reportedly numbering in the hundreds while Illyrian losses exceeded 7,000 dead. The conquest of Thracian territories proceeded more gradually as Philip recognized the need to maintain diplomatic relationships with powerful Thracian kingdoms while gradually extending Macedonian influence eastward. The capture of Crinides and its transformation into Philippi provided a crucial foothold in eastern Thrace, while subsequent campaigns secured control over the coastal regions between the Strymon and Nestos rivers. These territorial gains not only expanded Macedonia's resource base, but also provided strategic depth against potential Persian intervention from Asia Minor. Philip's diplomatic mastery in Greek affairs developed gradually as his military and economic strength provided the foundation for increasingly ambitious political initiatives. The Third Sacred War, which erupted in 356 BCE over control of the Delphic sanctuary, presented Philip with an unprecedented opportunity to intervene directly in central Greek politics. The conflict's religious dimensions and the involvement of major powers including Thebes, Athens, and Sparta created a complex web of alliances and enmities that a skilled diplomat could exploit to Macedonia's advantage. The Phocian seizure of Delphi and their subsequent use of the sanctuary's treasures to hire mercenary armies created widespread outrage throughout the Greek world, while providing Philip with a legitimate pretext for intervention. As a member of the Delphic Amphictyonii, Macedonia had both the right and the religious obligation to participate in efforts to restore the sanctuary's independence. Philip's initial involvement remained limited, but as the war dragged on and traditional powers exhausted themselves in feudal campaigns, Macedonian influence steadily expanded. The siege and capture of Methone in 354 BCE, though costly in personal terms due to the arrow wound that cost Philip his right eye, demonstrated Macedonia's growing capability to project power throughout the northern Aegean region. The city's strategic position controlling access to the Thermaic Gulf had made it a persistent threat to Macedonian commercial interests, while its Athenian connections provided a potential base for hostile operations against Philip's expanding kingdom. The successful siege eliminated this threat, while providing another example of Macedonian siege warfare capabilities. Philip's intervention in Thessaly, beginning in 353 BCE, marked a crucial expansion of Macedonian influence into central Greece. The complex political situation in Thessaly, with multiple cities and tribal groups competing for dominance, while facing external threats from Phocian forces, created opportunities for a powerful external patron to establish lasting influence. Philip's marriage to Nicopolis of Pherai provided a diplomatic foundation for intervention, while his military capabilities offered the Salian cities the prospect of effective protection against their enemies. The battles of the Crocus Field in 352 BCE represented Philip's most significant military victory to date, and established his reputation as the dominant military commander in the Greek world. Facing a Phocian army under Onimarchus that included substantial numbers of experienced mercenaries and advanced siege equipment, Philip demonstrated the tactical flexibility and innovative thinking that characterized his approach to warfare. The Macedonian victory resulted in the deaths of over 6,000 Phocian soldiers, including Onimarchus himself, while establishing Philip as the protector of Thessaly and a major player in the Sacred War. The formation of the League of Corinth in 337 BCE represented the culmination of Philip's diplomatic strategy for achieving hegemony over the Greek world. Rather than attempting to rule the Greek cities directly through military occupation, Philip created a federal structure that preserved the appearance of autonomy while ensuring Macedonian control over foreign policy and military affairs. The League's constitution established Philip as hegemon with authority to command allied forces and settle disputes between member states, while individual cities retained control over their internal affairs. The League's membership included virtually every significant Greek state except Sparta, creating an unprecedented coalition under Macedonian leadership. The careful balance between autonomy and control reflected Philip's understanding that Greek cities would accept Macedonian hegemony only if their fundamental political institutions remained intact. The League's federal structure also provided a mechanism for channeling Greek military resources toward external objectives rather than internal conflicts, setting the stage for the projected campaign against Persia. The declaration of war against Persia, formally approved by the League of Corinth in 337 BCE, represented both the logical culmination of Philip's Greek policy and the beginning of an entirely new phase in Macedonian expansion. The war's official justification centered on avenging Persian sacrilege during the invasions of 490 and 480 BCE, a theme that resonated powerfully with Greek public opinion while providing religious sanction for what was essentially a war of conquest. Philip's preliminary expedition across the Hellespont in 336 BCE, led by Parmenion and Attalus, established Macedonian footholds in Asia Minor while demonstrating the feasibility of large-scale operations against Persian territory. The advanced planning for the Persian campaign revealed the sophisticated logistical and strategic thinking that characterized Philip's approach to military operations. Rather than launching an immediate invasion with maximum force, Philip opted for a gradual buildup that would establish secure supply lines and local support before committing his main army to operations in Asia. The preliminary expedition's success in liberating several Greek cities from Persian control provided both strategic advantages and powerful propaganda for the larger campaign to follow. Philip's assassination at his daughter's wedding in October 336 BCE created an immediate succession crisis that threatened to unravel 2 decades of careful political and military construction. The 20-year-old Alexander faced challenges that would have destroyed lesser men: rival claimants backed by foreign powers, rebellious Greek cities sensing opportunity in Macedonia's apparent weakness, and restive northern tribes eager to reclaim territories lost to Philip's expansion. The young king's response to these multiple crises would demonstrate both the tactical brilliance inherited from his father and the ruthless decisiveness that would characterize his entire reign. The circumstances surrounding Philip's death had created particularly dangerous complications for the succession. Pausanias of Orestes, the assassin, had struck during the most public possible moment, suggesting either careful planning or foreign instigation. The presence of numerous foreign dignitaries and Greek representatives at the wedding meant that news of Philip's death would spread rapidly throughout the Mediterranean world, potentially triggering coordinated rebellions before Alexander could consolidate his position. The new king's immediate actions in the hours following his father's assassination revealed a political sophistication that belied his youth. Alexander's first priority involved securing the loyalty of the Macedonian army and nobility, the twin pillars upon which Argead power ultimately rested. The companion cavalry and the royal bodyguards had witnessed Philip's assassination directly, but their initial reaction remained uncertain as various factions within the Macedonian elite began calculating their positions in the new political landscape. Antipater, Philip's most trusted general and administrator, immediately declared his support for Alexander, providing crucial legitimacy for the young king's claim. However, other prominent figures, including Attalus, who commanded the advance force in Asia Minor, maintained studied silence that suggested potential opposition. The elimination of potential rivals proceeded with methodical efficiency that demonstrated Alexander's understanding of Macedonian political realities. Amyntas IV, Alexander's cousin and the rightful heir according to some interpretations of Macedonian law, posed the most immediate threat due to his legitimate bloodline and existing support among certain noble families. Rather than allowing this challenge to fester, Alexander ordered Amyntas' execution within days of assuming power, eliminating the most credible alternative claimant before opposition could coalesce around his candidacy. The purge extended beyond immediate family members to include other potential sources of instability within the Macedonian power structure. Attalus, whose marriage connection to Philip had created tensions with Alexander's mother Olympias, found himself in an increasingly precarious position as the new king consolidated power. Alexander's agents in Asia Minor eliminated Attalus before he could either declare independence or throw his support behind an alternative claimant, demonstrating the new king's ability to project lethal force across vast distances when necessary. The speed and thoroughness of these eliminations sent clear messages to both domestic and foreign audiences about Alexander's character and capabilities. Unlike his father, who had often preferred diplomatic solutions and gradual consolidation, Alexander showed immediate willingness to employ extreme measures when he perceived threats to his authority. This approach reflected both the urgency of his situation and a fundamental difference in temperament that would influence all his subsequent decisions. The Greek world's reaction to Philip's death exceeded even Alexander's worst expectations, as cities throughout central and southern Greece interpreted the succession crisis as an opportunity to throw off Macedonian hegemony. Athens, despite its recent accommodation with Philip, immediately began mobilizing its military forces while sending diplomatic missions to potential allies throughout the Greek world. Demosthenes, Philip's most persistent opponent, allegedly celebrated the news of the king's death by appearing in public wearing festive garments despite being in official mourning for his own daughter. Thebes presented the most serious immediate threat to Macedonian interests in Greece. The city's strategic position controlling access routes between northern and southern Greece made it crucial to any effective resistance movement, while its military reputation and recent history of opposition to Macedonian expansion provided natural leadership credentials for anti-Macedonian coalitions. Theban politicians began immediate negotiations with Athens, Sparta, and other potential allies, seeking to construct a coalition capable of challenging Macedonian power before Alexander could fully consolidate his position. The northern frontiers simultaneously erupted in rebellion as Illyrian, Thracian, and Paeonian tribes sensed opportunity in Macedonia's apparent weakness. These peoples had submitted to Philip's expansion reluctantly, maintaining their traditional social structures and military capabilities while paying tribute to Macedonian administrators. News of Philip's death and reports of internal Macedonian instability triggered coordinated uprisings across the entire northern frontier, threatening to roll back decades of territorial expansion and expose Macedonia's heartland to direct attack. Alexander's response to these multiple challenges revealed both strategic acumen and tactical flexibility that would become hallmarks of his military career. Rather than attempting to address all threats simultaneously, he prioritized targets based on their immediate danger to Macedonian security and their potential for triggering broader coalitions against his rule. The Greek cities, despite their symbolic importance, posed less immediate military threat than the northern tribes, whose proximity to Macedonia's core territories made them capable of striking directly at the kingdom's economic and demographic foundations. The Thracian campaign of 335 BCE demonstrated Alexander's ability to conduct complex military operations while managing delicate political situations. The Triballi, a powerful Thracian confederation, had established positions along the Danube River that threatened Macedonian supply lines and provided potential bases for more extensive anti-Macedonian coalitions. Alexander's decision to campaign personally against these tribes served multiple purposes, eliminating a direct military threat, demonstrating his capabilities to potential rebels throughout the region, and providing his army with combat experience under his personal command. The crossing of the Danube represented one of Alexander's most audacious early military operations, showcasing both tactical innovation and psychological warfare techniques that would characterize his later campaigns. Faced with Thracian forces positioned on the river's northern bank, Alexander improvised a night crossing using local fishing boats, leather tent covers stuffed with hay, and cavalry swimming alongside their mounts. The operation's success depended on precise coordination between different military units and careful reconnaissance of local conditions, demonstrating the high level of training and discipline that Philip's reforms had instilled in the Macedonian army. The psychological impact of the Danube crossing extended far beyond its immediate tactical consequences. Alexander's willingness to lead his forces across a major river barrier in the face of enemy opposition demonstrated both personal courage and confidence in his army's capabilities. The operation's success against a formidable opponent in difficult terrain sent clear messages to potential rebels throughout the region about the new king's military competence and determination to maintain Macedonian territorial integrity. The Illyrian campaign that followed revealed Alexander's growing mastery of combined arms tactics and siege warfare techniques inherited from his father's military innovations. The Illyrian king Clitus had established a strong defensive position at Pelium, a fortified city that controlled crucial mountain passes between Macedonia and the Adriatic coast. Traditional siege methods would have required months of investment and enormous logistical support, but Alexander employed innovative tactics that combined direct assault with psychological pressure to achieve rapid victory. The siege of Pelium showcased several tactical innovations that would become standard elements of Alexander's military repertoire. Rather than simply surrounding the city and waiting for starvation to force surrender, Alexander employed coordinated attacks by different military units designed to overwhelm defenders at multiple points simultaneously. The Macedonian phalanx advanced against the main gates, while companion cavalry threatened enemy supply lines, and light infantry infiltrated defensive positions through careful reconnaissance of weak points in the fortifications. The battle's most famous episode involved Alexander's personal leadership during a critical moment when Illyrian forces threatened to break Macedonian lines through concentrated attacks on isolated units. The young king's decision to lead a cavalry charge directly into the enemy formation demonstrated both tactical judgment and personal courage, as he recognized that only dramatic action could restore momentum to the Macedonian assault. The charge's success resulted from careful coordination between cavalry and infantry units, with the phalanx providing supporting pressure while the companions exploited gaps created by their initial impact. News of Alexander's northern victories reached Greece at a crucial moment when anti-Macedonian coalitions were beginning to solidify into active military preparations. The speed and completeness of his success against formidable opponents like the Triballi and Illyrians forced Greek cities to recalculate their assessments of Macedonian strength and Alexander's personal capabilities. However, rather than deterring rebellion, these victories may have actually accelerated Greek preparations for revolt by convincing potential rebels that they needed to act quickly before Alexander could turn his full attention southward. The Theban revolt erupted in late summer 335 BCE when a group of Theban exiles returned to the city with claims that Alexander had died during his northern campaigns. These rumors, whether spread deliberately or arising from genuine confusion about events in distant Thrace, provided the catalyst for long-simmering resentment against Macedonian control to explode into open rebellion. The Theban assembly voted to expel the Macedonian garrison from the CATMIU, the citadel that had served as the symbol of foreign domination since Philip's conquest of the city. The revolt's initial success encouraged similar movements throughout central Greece as cities that had reluctantly accepted Macedonian hegemony began to consider active resistance. Athens, while maintaining official neutrality, provided covert support to the Theban rebels through financial assistance and diplomatic encouragement. Spartan forces began mobilizing in the Peloponnese, while various smaller cities, central Greece, expelled Macedonian sympathizers and began preparing their defenses for the inevitable confrontation. Alexander's response to the Theban revolt demonstrated both strategic patience and tactical decisiveness that would become characteristic of his approach to political military problems. Rather than rushing southward immediately upon receiving news of the rebellion, he completed his northern campaigns methodically while gathering intelligence about the situation in Greece. This approach allowed him to arrive in central Greece with his forces intact and fully prepared for sustained operations, while his apparent delay may have encouraged the rebels to commit themselves more fully to resistance. The march from Macedonia to Thebes covered approximately 200 miles of difficult terrain in just 13 days, a logistical achievement that demonstrated the high level of training and organization that characterized Alexander's army. The rapid movement surprised the Theban rebels, who had expected several weeks of preparation time before facing Macedonian retaliation. Alexander's forces appeared outside Theban walls before the city's allies could provide effective support, isolating the rebels and forcing them to face the full weight of Macedonian military power without external assistance. The siege of Thebes revealed Alexander's mastery of psychological warfare techniques, combined with overwhelming military superiority. Rather than immediately launching full-scale assaults against the city's formidable fortifications, Alexander positioned his forces to demonstrate Macedonian strength while offering terms for peaceful surrender. The king's initial restraint reflected both practical considerations about the costs of urban warfare and political calculations about the impact of his actions on Greek public opinion. The final assault on Thebes began when a Macedonian soldier, apparently acting without direct orders, scaled a section of the city's walls and opened a gate for his comrades. Whether this action represented genuine individual initiative or carefully orchestrated theater designed to provide Alexander with plausible deniability remains unclear, but its consequences proved devastating for the city's defenders. Macedonian forces poured through the breach, while coordinated attacks at other points prevented effective resistance or organized withdrawal. The destruction that followed Alexander's capture of Thebes exceeded anything previously seen in Greek warfare, as Macedonian soldiers and their Greek allies systematically demolished one of the ancient and culturally significant cities in the Greek world. The scale of destruction reflected both military necessity and calculated political terrorism, as Alexander sought to create an example that would deter future rebellions while satisfying his allies' demands for revenge against their traditional enemy. The human cost of Thebes' destruction included approximately 6,000 dead and 30,000 enslaved, figures that represented a substantial portion of the city's total population. The systematic nature of the killing and enslavement, which targeted civilians as well as combatants, demonstrated Alexander's willingness to employ extreme measures when he perceived challenges to his authority. The preservation of only Pindar's house and the city's temples reflected both respect for Greek cultural traditions and careful attention to religious sensitivities that might influence public opinion throughout the Greek world. The psychological impact of Thebes' fate resonated throughout Greece with an intensity that exceeded even Alexander's expectations. Cities that had been considering rebellion immediately submitted to Macedonian authority, while those already in revolt quickly sought terms for peaceful resolution of their conflicts with Macedonia. The demonstration of Macedonian military capability, combined with Alexander's willingness to employ devastating force against rebels, created a climate of fear that effectively ended organized resistance to his rule. Athens' reaction to the Theban catastrophe illustrated the complex calculations that Greek cities faced when confronting Macedonian power. Despite Demosthenes' continued advocacy for resistance, the Athenian assembly voted to send an embassy to Alexander, requesting forgiveness for their covert support of the Theban rebels. The king's decision to accept Athenian submission without demanding harsh penalties reflected both magnanimity and practical politics, as he recognized that excessive punishment might drive other cities to desperate resistance rather than peaceful accommodation. The completion of Alexander's Greek pacification campaigns by late 335 BCE provided the foundation for renewed focus on the Persian expedition that had been interrupted by Philip's assassination. The demonstration of Macedonian military supremacy and Alexander's personal capabilities had eliminated the immediate threats to the kingdom's security, while establishing his credibility as Philip's legitimate successor. However, the brutal suppression of the Theban revolt had also revealed aspects of Alexander's character that would influence all his subsequent relationships with subject peoples. The logistical preparations for the Asian expedition resumed with renewed intensity, as Alexander's staff began assembling the enormous quantities of supplies, equipment, and personnel necessary for sustained operations across the Hellespont. The army that would cross into Asia represented the culmination of Philip's military reforms, combined with innovations developed during Alexander's early campaigns. The core Macedonian units retained their traditional organization and equipment, but Alexander had also incorporated specialized troops from throughout his expanded kingdom and allied territories. The companion cavalry, numbering approximately 1,800 men organized into 8 squadrons, represented the elite striking force of Alexander's army. These heavy cavalry units rode the finest horses available in Macedonia and Thessaly, animals specifically bred for carrying armored riders in sustained combat operations. The companions' equipment included long cavalry spears, curved swords, and bronze armor that provided protection while maintaining the mobility necessary for effective cavalry operations. The Macedonian phalanx formations totaled approximately 9,000 men organized into 6 battalions, each recruited from specific regions of the kingdom and maintaining distinct regional identities within the larger military structure. The phalangites carried sarissas measuring up to 18 feet in length, small shields and bronze armor that provided reasonable protection while allowing the flexibility necessary for complex maneuvers. The phalanx's training emphasized coordination and discipline rather than individual combat skills, reflecting Philip's understanding that collective action provided greater battlefield effectiveness than personal heroism. The allied Greek contingents, totaling approximately 7,000 infantry and 600 cavalry, provided both military capability and political legitimacy for the expedition. These forces represented contributions from the League of Corinth members, demonstrating their commitment to the war against Persia while providing Alexander with experienced troops familiar with Greek fighting methods. The inclusion of substantial allied forces also served propaganda purposes, as it reinforced the expedition's character as a pan-Hellenic crusade rather than purely Macedonian conquest. The crossing of the Hellespont in spring 334 BCE marked the beginning of Alexander's Asian campaigns and represented both a practical military operation and a carefully orchestrated symbolic event. The king's decision to land at the site of ancient Troy reflected his conscious identification with Achilles and the heroic traditions of Greek literature, while the elaborate sacrifices and ceremonies that accompanied the landing demonstrated respect for religious traditions that might influence public opinion throughout the Greek world. The army that disembarked on Asian soil represented one of the most formidable military instruments ever assembled in the ancient world, combining traditional Macedonian strengths with innovations developed through 2 decades of continuous warfare. The logistical support systems that sustained this force during its initial operations in Asia Minor reflected sophisticated planning and organization that would prove crucial to the expedition's ultimate success. Alexander's early campaigns had demonstrated his ability to manage complex political and military challenges while maintaining the loyalty and effectiveness of his forces, providing the foundation for the unprecedented conquest that would follow. The Persian satrap Argead had positioned his forces along the steep eastern bank of the Granicus River with calculated precision, transforming the natural obstacle into a formidable defensive position that capitalized on both terrain advantages and tactical preferences of his diverse army. The river itself, swollen by spring rains and mountain snowmelt, flowed approximately 40 feet wide with muddy banks that would challenge any attacking force attempting to establish footholds on the opposite shore. Persian and allied cavalry, numbering roughly 20,000 horsemen, occupied elevated positions along the riverbank where they could deliver devastating charges against any troops struggling to emerge from the water. The Persian defensive deployment reflected sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics, with different unit types positioned to maximize their respective advantages while covering each other's vulnerabilities. Memnon of Rhodes, the Greek mercenary commander who served as Argead's principal military advisor, had argued for a defensive strategy that would draw Alexander deeper into Anatolia while systematically destroying resources that might sustain his army. However, the Persian satrap's concerns about appearing cowardly before their king had overruled Memnon's strategic advice, leading to the decision to offer immediate battle at the Granicus crossing. Alexander's approach to the river revealed tactical thinking that combined audacious aggression with careful attention to terrain and enemy dispositions. Rather than accepting the obvious crossing point directly in front of the Persian positions, Alexander conducted detailed reconnaissance of alternative sites while simultaneously preparing for a frontal assault that would fix enemy attention on the expected axis of attack. The Macedonian army's deployment demonstrated the sophisticated coordination between different military arms that had been perfected during Philip's reforms and refined through Alexander's early campaigns. The companion cavalry took position on the army's right wing, with Alexander personally commanding the royal squadron, while Philotas commanded the remaining 7 squadrons. The cavalry's positioning reflected both tactical necessity and symbolic importance, as Alexander's personal leadership of the decisive attack would demonstrate his courage while ensuring that victory credit accrued to his personal reputation. The companions' horses, bred specifically for carrying armored riders across difficult terrain, showed the results of decades of selective breeding programs that had produced animals capable of sustained combat operations under the most demanding conditions. The Macedonian phalanx occupied the center of Alexander's battle line, with each battalion maintaining its regional identity while contributing to the formation's overall cohesion and striking power. The phalangites had spent months training for river crossing operations, practicing the complex maneuvers necessary to maintain formation integrity, while negotiating obstacles that could easily disrupt less disciplined units. Their sarissas, normally held at varying angles depending on tactical requirements, would need to be managed carefully during the crossing to avoid entanglement, while maintaining readiness for immediate combat upon reaching the opposite bank. Parmenion commanded the left wing with a mixture of Thessalian cavalry and allied Greek infantry, units that provided both tactical flexibility and political representation for the expedition's Panhellenic character. The Thessalian horsemen, renowned throughout the Greek world for their riding skills and battlefield effectiveness, had adapted their traditional equipment and tactics to complement Macedonian operational methods while retaining their distinctive regional fighting style. Their positioning on the left wing reflected both their capabilities and Alexander's confidence in Parmenion's ability to coordinate complex operations involving multiple unit types. The battle's opening phase began with Alexander's characteristic blend of personal leadership and tactical innovation, as he led a preliminary cavalry charge across the river at an oblique angle that avoided the strongest Persian positions, while creating opportunities for the main assault. The companion cavalry's horses struggled against the muddy river bank and swift current, but their training and conditioning allowed them to maintain formation coherence while under direct attack from Persian cavalry and missile troops positioned on the high ground. Persian resistance proved fierce and well-coordinated, with Spithridates and Ruazes leading concentrated cavalry charges designed to overwhelm the Macedonian bridgehead before it could be reinforced or expanded. The Persian cavalry's tactical approach emphasized individual combat prowess and the shock effect of mass charges, techniques that had proven effective against traditional Greek armies but faced new challenges. When confronting the disciplined formations and coordinated tactics of Alexander's forces, the Persian horsemen carried traditional cavalry weapons, including javelins, curved swords, and small shields that provided mobility while offering reasonable protection against most opponents. The fighting along the riverbank reached critical intensity as Persian forces concentrated their attacks on Alexander's personal position, recognizing that eliminating the Macedonian king would likely collapse the entire invasion before it could establish momentum. Spithridates struck directly at Alexander with a battle-axe that split the king's helmet, while Ruazes prepared to deliver a killing blow that was only prevented by Clitus the Black's intervention. The Persian cavalry's focus on Alexander reflected both tactical understanding and political calculation, as they recognized that the expedition's success depended entirely on his personal leadership and charismatic authority. Alexander's survival of these direct attacks, combined with his continued aggressive leadership of the cavalry action, provided crucial psychological advantages that influenced the battle's subsequent development. The sight of their king fighting personally in the front ranks while surviving concentrated enemy attacks reinforced the Macedonian soldiers' confidence in both his tactical judgment and divine protection. The Persian forces, conversely, began to show signs of demoralization as their most determined efforts failed to eliminate the primary target of their attacks. The Macedonian phalanx's crossing of the Granicus demonstrated the tactical flexibility and disciplined training that distinguished Philip's military reforms from traditional Greek infantry methods. Rather than attempting to maintain perfect formation integrity during the crossing, the Phalangites adapted their deployment to local conditions while preserving their ability to resume coordinated action once they reached the opposite bank. The battalion commander's skill in managing this complex operation under combat conditions reflected years of professional military experience and intensive training in varied terrain conditions. The Persian infantry, consisting primarily of Greek mercenaries under Memnon's command, occupied defensive positions behind the cavalry where they could provide supporting fire while preparing to engage any Macedonian forces that successfully crossed the river. These mercenary units, numbering approximately 20,000 men, represented some of the finest professional soldiers available in the contemporary world, with extensive combat experience and equipment that matched or exceeded that of Alexander's forces. Their positioning reflected Memnon's understanding that the battle's outcome would likely depend on the cavalry action, but that infantry reserves would prove crucial if the fighting developed into a prolonged engagement. The collapse of Persian resistance began when concentrated Macedonian pressure at multiple crossing points prevented effective coordination of the defensive effort. Alexander's personal breakthrough with the companion cavalry created a gap in the Persian line that could not be sealed by local reserves, while simultaneous pressure from the phalanx and left-wing forces stretched the defenders beyond their ability to maintain coherent positions. The Persian cavalry's tactical doctrine, which emphasized individual prowess and small unit actions, proved inadequate for managing a coordinated defense against multiple threats operating according to unified command decisions. The pursuit phase of the battle revealed both the devastating effectiveness of Macedonian combined arms tactics and Alexander's understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. Rather than allowing defeated Persian forces to withdraw in good order, Alexander coordinated cavalry and infantry pursuit that transformed tactical defeat into strategic catastrophe for his opponents. The systematic nature of this pursuit, which targeted command structures and supply systems, as well as individual soldiers, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how military victories could be converted into lasting political advantages. The Greek mercenaries' fate illustrated Alexander's complex relationship with Greek identity and his ruthless approach to potential opposition. Rather than offering terms for surrender that might have preserved these experienced soldiers for future service, Alexander ordered their systematic destruction as traitors to the Pan-Hellenic cause. This decision reflected both propaganda considerations and practical calculations about the dangers of allowing skilled opponents to escape and potentially reorganize resistance elsewhere in the Persian Empire. The strategic implications of the Granicus victory extended far beyond its immediate tactical consequences, as Alexander's demonstration of Macedonian military superiority fundamentally altered the political landscape throughout Western Anatolia. Persian satraps who had been prepared to resist the invasion began reconsidering their positions, while Greek cities under Persian control started calculating the advantages of voluntary submission versus continued loyalty to their increasingly vulnerable overlords. The speed and completeness of the Macedonian victory suggested that Persian military power in the region might be more fragile than previously assumed. Alexander's treatment of captured Persian nobles revealed his sophisticated approach to managing conquered territories and populations. Rather than executing high-ranking prisoners or demanding enormous ransoms that might bankrupt their families, Alexander employed a mixture of clemency and calculated political pressure designed to encourage cooperation from Persian elites who might otherwise organize continued resistance. This approach reflected both practical considerations about the administrative challenges of governing vast territories and strategic thinking about the long-term requirements for maintaining control over diverse populations. The liberation of Greek cities along the Anatolian coast proceeded according to carefully planned propaganda campaigns that emphasized Alexander's role as the champion of Greek freedom, while obscuring the realities of Macedonian control. Ephesus, one of the most prosperous and politically significant cities in the region, received Alexander with elaborate ceremonies that celebrated the restoration of democratic government and the expulsion of Persian-backed oligarchs. The king's decision to restore confiscated property and recall political exiles created powerful incentives for other cities to welcome Macedonian forces rather than resist them. However, the complex realities of liberation became apparent as Alexander's administrators began implementing new governmental structures that preserved the appearance of autonomy while ensuring effective Macedonian control over crucial policy decisions. The appointment of Macedonian garrison commanders and the establishment of tribute obligations revealed that Greek freedom under Alexander differed significantly from genuine independence, though the new arrangements often proved less burdensome than previous Persian administration. The Greek cities' enthusiastic reception of these changes reflected both their relief at escaping Persian control and their recognition that accommodation with Macedonia offered better prospects than feudal resistance. The siege of Halicarnassus presented Alexander with his first major test of the siege warfare capabilities that he had inherited from Philip's military innovations. The city's formidable fortifications, strengthened by Memnon's engineering expertise and defended by substantial forces of Greek mercenaries and Persian regulars, required sophisticated tactical coordination between infantry assault forces, cavalry units, and specialized siege equipment. The operation's complexity demanded careful logistical planning and sustained coordination between different military specialists, testing the organizational systems that supported Alexander's army. Memnon's defensive strategy for Halicarnassus demonstrated sophisticated understanding of siege warfare principles and the tactical challenges facing attacking forces. Rather than simply manning the walls and waiting for assault, the defenders conducted aggressive sorties designed to disrupt Macedonian siege operations, while inflicting casualties that would gradually weaken the attacking force. These operations required careful coordination between different defensive units and precise timing to avoid being caught in exposed positions by Macedonian counterattacks. The Macedonian siege operations revealed significant innovations in the integration of different military technologies and tactical approaches. Alexander's engineers employed battering rams, siege towers, and catapults in coordinated attacks that concentrated overwhelming force against specific sections of the defensive perimeter while preventing effective enemy countermeasures. The siege equipment's effectiveness depended on careful positioning and protection by infantry units that could repel defensive sorties while maintaining the steady pressure necessary to breach fortified positions. The development of combined arms tactics during the Halicarnassus siege influenced Alexander's approach to similar operations throughout his subsequent campaigns. The integration of heavy infantry, light troops, cavalry, and siege specialists into coordinated operational systems required sophisticated command and control procedures that could adapt to changing tactical situations while maintaining overall strategic objectives. The lessons learned during this extended operation provided crucial experience for the more challenging sieges that Alexander would face as his campaigns progressed deeper into the Persian Empire. The administrative innovations that Alexander implemented in conquered Anatolian territories reflected both practical necessity and strategic vision for managing the diverse populations and complex political structures that characterized the Persian Empire. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Macedonian governmental systems throughout the region, Alexander adopted flexible approaches that preserved existing administrative structures while ensuring effective control over crucial policy areas, including taxation, military recruitment, and foreign relations. The retention of Persian satraps in several key positions demonstrated Alexander's recognition that effective governance required officials with detailed knowledge of local conditions and established relationships with regional elites. Satraps like Mizarces in Egypt and Pharnabazus in parts of Anatolia continued in their positions under Macedonian oversight, providing continuity in administrative functions while gradually adapting to new policy directions emanating from Alexander's court. This approach reduced the immediate costs of conquest while creating incentives for Persian officials to cooperate with the new regime. The integration of local elites into Macedonian administrative structures proceeded through careful balance of inducements and constraints designed to encourage cooperation while preventing the development of independent power bases that might challenge royal authority. Prominent Persian and Greek families received honors, marriage connections, and administrative positions that provided them with status and influence within the new system, while binding their interests to the success of Alexander's regime. These relationships required constant attention and adjustment as political circumstances evolved and new challenges emerged. The establishment of new cities and the expansion of existing urban centers reflected Alexander's understanding that effective control over vast territories required strong administrative centers capable of projecting power throughout their surrounding regions. Alexandria and Egypt represented the most ambitious of these foundations, but smaller cities throughout Anatolia also received significant investment in infrastructure and population that enhanced their capacity to serve as regional administrative centers. These urban development projects created employment opportunities and commercial advantages that helped generate popular support for Macedonian rule, while providing practical benefits for imperial administration. The administrative consolidation of Western Anatolia provided Alexander with the secure territorial base necessary for advancing deeper into the Persian Empire. But intelligence reports from Macedonian scouts operating along the Syrian frontier revealed that Darius III had abandoned his initial strategy of relying on satraps and regional commanders. The Persian king had personally assumed command of a massive army assembled from across his empire, creating a concentration of military power that dwarfed anything Alexander had previously encountered. Persian forces numbering over 100,000 men had established positions near the town of Issus, strategically located where the coastal plain narrowed between the Mediterranean Sea and the Amanus Mountains. Darius' decision to offer battle at Issus reflected both the Persian Empire's desperate need for a decisive victory and the king's confidence in his numerical superiority and tactical advantages. The position offered several benefits for the Persian army. The narrow coastal plain would prevent Alexander from fully deploying his forces while negating the Macedonian advantages in tactical flexibility and coordinated maneuvers. The Persian cavalry, traditionally the empire's most effective military arm, could operate from secure flanks while the massive infantry formations pressed forward against the constricted Macedonian line. The Persian army's composition revealed the empire's vast resources and diverse military traditions, with contingents drawn from satrapies spanning 3 continents. The Immortals, Persia's elite infantry guard numbering 10,000 men, occupied the center of the battle line with their distinctive scaled armor, long spears and rectangular shields decorated with golden lions and eagles. These professional soldiers represented the pinnacle of Persian military development, with standardized equipment, intensive training, and combat experience gained through decades of frontier warfare and internal security operations. Greek mercenary units, numbering approximately 30,000 men under the command of experienced officers who had served throughout the Mediterranean world, provided the Persian army with tactical expertise specifically designed to counter Macedonian fighting methods. These mercenaries carried equipment identical to Alexander's own forces, including long spears, bronze armor, and large shields, while their training emphasized the disciplined formation fighting that had proven effective against Macedonian tactics in previous engagements. Their positioning in the Persian center, directly opposite the Macedonian phalanx, reflected Darius's understanding that the battle's outcome would likely depend on infantry combat rather than cavalry action. Persian cavalry forces, totaling nearly 20,000 horsemen drawn from the empire's traditional recruiting grounds in Media, Bactria, and Scythia, occupied both flanks of the battle line where their mobility could be exploited most effectively. The heavy cavalry wore bronze or iron armor with conical helmets, carrying long lances and curved swords that provided advantages in both shot combat and sustained melee fighting. Their horses, bred in the vast pastures of the Iranian plateau, possessed the size and strength necessary to carry armored riders while maintaining the speed and endurance required for extended battlefield operations. Alexander's approach to the Issus campaign demonstrated his growing mastery of strategic deception and operational planning as he successfully concealed his army's movements while gathering detailed intelligence about Persian dispositions and intentions. Macedonian scouts, operating in small groups throughout the Amanus Mountains, provided continuous reports on Persian troop movements while identifying potential routes for flanking maneuvers that might exploit weaknesses in Darius's defensive positions. The intelligence-gathering operation revealed both the scale of the Persian concentration and the tactical constraints imposed by the terrain. The Macedonian army's deployment at Issus reflected tactical innovations developed through 2 years of continuous campaigning against diverse opponents in varied terrain conditions. Alexander positioned his forces to maximize their advantages in coordination and tactical flexibility while minimizing the impact of Persian numerical superiority. The companion cavalry, reduced to approximately 1,500 men through casualties and detachments, took position on the right wing, where Alexander could lead them personally against the crucial sector of the Persian line. The Macedonian phalanx, numbering roughly 8,000 men organized into 6 battalions, occupied the center of the battle line with careful attention to maintaining formation integrity despite the constricted terrain. The Phalangites had adapted their equipment and tactics for operations in the narrow coastal plain, shortening their sarissas to 14 feet to improve maneuverability while maintaining sufficient reach to counter Persian spear formations. Each battalion retained its regional identity and command structure, providing flexibility in tactical deployment while preserving the unit cohesion that had proven crucial in previous engagements. Parmenion commanded the left wing with Thessalian cavalry and allied Greek infantry, units that would face the most challenging tactical situation due to the terrain constraints and the concentration of Persian heavy cavalry on that sector. The Thessalian horsemen, numbering approximately 1,800, had proven their effectiveness in previous battles, but would need to operate in much more confined space while facing opponents who possessed significant advantages in numbers and local terrain knowledge. Their positioning reflected both their capabilities and Alexander's confidence in Parmenion's tactical judgment. The battle's opening phase began with skirmishing between light infantry forces as both armies maneuvered for advantageous positions within the constraints imposed by the coastal terrain. Persian archers, numbering several thousand men drawn from throughout the empire, attempted to disrupt Macedonian formations through concentrated missile fire while maintaining safe distances from enemy heavy infantry. The effectiveness of this preliminary bombardment depended on precise range estimation and coordinated volleys that could inflict significant casualties before the battle lines engaged. Macedonian light infantry, including Agrianians, Thracians, and Cretan archers, responded with their own missile attacks while conducting aggressive reconnaissance missions designed to identify weaknesses in the Persian deployment. These specialized troops possess superior individual training and more flexible tactical doctrine than their Persian counterparts, allowing them to operate effectively in the broken terrain along the battle line's flanks, while providing crucial intelligence about enemy dispositions and intentions. Alexander's personal leadership during the cavalry engagement on the right wing demonstrated the tactical innovations that distinguished his approach to battlefield command from traditional Greek military practices. Rather than simply leading a frontal charge against the opposing cavalry, Alexander coordinated his attack with supporting infantry movements designed to create gaps in the Persian line while preventing effective enemy countermeasures. The companion cavalry's advance proceeded in echelon formation, with individual squadrons attacking in sequence to maintain continuous pressure while avoiding the simultaneous commitment that might allow Persian forces to concentrate their defensive efforts. The intensity of the cavalry combat exceeded anything previously experienced in Alexander's campaigns, as Persian heavy cavalry fought with desperate determination to prevent a Macedonian breakthrough that would expose their infantry formations to flank attacks. Persian horsemen employed traditional tactics, emphasizing individual combat prowess and a shock effect of concentrated charges, techniques that had proven effective against conventional opponents but faced new challenges when confronting the disciplined formations and coordinated maneuvers of Alexander's forces. The Persian cavalry's equipment reflected centuries of military development and adaptation to the specific requirements of mounted warfare on the Iranian plateau. Their horses, larger and more powerful than typical Greek animals, could carry heavier armor while maintaining the speed necessary for effective cavalry operations. The riders wore scale or mail armor that provided comprehensive protection while allowing sufficient flexibility for mounted combat. And their weapons included long lances, curved swords, and composite bows that offered versatility in different tactical situations. The decisive moment of the cavalry engagement came when Alexander personally led a concentrated attack against the sector of the Persian line, where Darius himself commanded from his distinctive chariot. The Persian king's position, marked by royal standards and surrounded by his personal guard, represented both a tactical objective and a symbolic target whose capture would likely determine a battle's outcome. Alexander's approach to this critical attack demonstrated both tactical calculation and personal courage, as he recognized that success would require him to expose himself to extreme danger while maintaining command coordination. The fighting around Darius' position reached extraordinary intensity, as the Persian royal guard attempted to protect their king, while Macedonian forces concentrated overwhelming pressure on this crucial sector. The Persian immortals, fighting on foot after dismounting from their horses, employed their traditional weapons and tactics in a desperate effort to prevent the Macedonian breakthrough. Their disciplined formations and standardized equipment provided significant advantages in sustained combat, but they faced opponents whose training and coordination had been perfected through continuous campaigning under Alexander's personal leadership. Darius' flight from the battlefield, whether motivated by genuine fear for his safety or calculated assessment of the tactical situation, triggered the collapse of Persian resistance throughout the battle line. The sight of their king abandoning the field demoralized Persian forces who had been fighting effectively against their Macedonian opponents, while simultaneously providing enormous psychological advantages to Alexander's army. The Persian withdrawal began as an organized retreat, but quickly degenerated into panic as Macedonian cavalry pursued fleeing enemies, while the phalanx advanced to exploit the gaps created in the Persian line. The capture of the Persian royal camp provided Alexander with unprecedented insights into the scale and sophistication of Persian imperial administration, as Darius' traveling court included not only his immediate family, but also extensive administrative apparatus responsible for governing the empire's diverse territories. The camp contained detailed records of provincial revenues, military recruitment quotas, and administrative correspondence that revealed both the empire's vast resources and the complex challenges involved in managing such diverse populations across enormous distances. Among the most significant captures were Darius' mother Sisygambes, his wife Statera, and his daughters, whose presence in Alexander's custody created immediate diplomatic opportunities while demonstrating the Persian king's confidence in his military superiority. The royal women's treatment became a crucial test of Alexander's political sophistication, as their welfare would influence Persian public opinion and potentially affect the loyalty of provincial governors throughout the empire. Alexander's decision to treat them with elaborate courtesy and respect, maintaining their royal status while ensuring their security, reflected both personal magnanimity and calculated political strategy. The psychological impact of capturing the Persian royal family extended far beyond its immediate propaganda value, as it demonstrated to audiences throughout the empire that Darius had failed in his fundamental obligation to protect those closest to him. Persian political culture placed enormous emphasis on the king's role as protector of his people, and the loss of his own family members suggested either military incompetence or divine displeasure that might justify transfer of allegiance to more successful leaders. Alexander's respectful treatment of the captives reinforced these impressions, while positioning him as a legitimate claimant to Persian royal authority. The strategic implications of the Issus victory transformed the entire character of Alexander's expedition, as the defeat of Darius's main army opened possibilities for operations throughout the empire's heartland, while eliminating the most serious threat to Macedonian control over conquered territories. Persian satraps who'd been preparing resistance movements began reconsidering their positions, while subject peoples throughout the empire started calculating the advantages of accommodation with the apparently victorious Macedonians. The speed and completeness of the victory suggested that Persian military power might be fundamentally inferior to Macedonian capabilities, rather than simply disadvantaged by local circumstances. However, the immediate aftermath of Issus also revealed the limitations of Alexander's current strategic position, as his army remained a relatively small force operating at enormous distances from its Macedonian base, while facing an empire that retained vast resources and millions of potential soldiers. The Persian Empire's sheer scale meant that even devastating defeats like Issus could be absorbed without necessarily resulting in complete collapse, while Alexander's extended supply lines and limited manpower made him vulnerable to coordinated resistance movements or prolonged campaigns of attrition. Alexander's decision to advance southward along the Mediterranean coast rather than pursuing Darius directly into Mesopotamia reflected sophisticated strategic thinking about the requirements for maintaining control over conquered territories while continuing offensive operations. The Phoenician cities controlled crucial naval bases that could threaten Macedonian supply lines or provide staging areas for Persian counterattacks, while the wealthy commercial centers of the Levantine coast offered resources that could support continued campaigning. The systematic reduction of these coastal strongholds would also demonstrate Macedonian power to audiences throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while eliminating potential threats to the expedition's rear areas. The siege of Tyre presented Alexander with the most challenging military operation of his career to date, as the city's position on an island approximately half a mile from the mainland coast made it virtually impregnable to traditional siege methods. The Tyrians possessed one of the most powerful navies in the Mediterranean world, with ships capable of preventing Macedonian access to the island while maintaining supply lines that could sustain indefinite resistance. The city's wealth, accumulated through centuries of commercial dominance, provided resources for hiring mercenaries and purchasing supplies that could support extended defensive operations. Tyrian defensive preparations revealed sophisticated understanding of siege warfare principles and the specific challenges facing attacking forces attempting to operate against island fortifications. The city's walls, constructed from massive stone blocks and rising directly from the sea on most sides, presented formidable obstacles that would require specialized equipment and innovative tactics to breach. The defenders possessed substantial quantities of artillery, including catapults and ballistae capable of engaging enemy ships or siege equipment at considerable distances. Alexander's solution to the tactical challenges posed by Tyre's island position demonstrated remarkable engineering innovation combined with strategic persistence that would characterize his approach to seemingly impossible military problems. The construction of a causeway connecting the mainland to the island required enormous quantities of stone, timber, and earth, while demanding sustained coordination between military engineers, construction workers, and combat units responsible for protecting the project from enemy interference. The causeway's width, approximately 200 feet, provided sufficient space for siege equipment while creating a permanent land connection that would transform Tyre's strategic position. The engineering challenges involved in the causeway construction exceeded anything previously attempted in ancient siege warfare, as the project required operations in water depths, reaching 150 feet while under constant attack from Tyrian naval forces and artillery. Macedonian engineers developed innovative techniques for underwater construction, including the use of massive stones lowered from specially constructed platforms, while divers worked to position foundation materials in precise locations. The project's success depended on careful coordination between different specialized teams working under extremely dangerous conditions. Tyrian resistance to the causeway construction employed both conventional military tactics and innovative defensive measures designed to exploit the project's vulnerabilities. Tyrian ships conducted regular attacks against Macedonian construction crews, while fireships attempted to destroy completed sections of the causeway and the siege equipment positioned on its surface. The defenders also employed divers to sabotage underwater construction work and specialized artillery to target key personnel and equipment involved in the project. The development of Macedonian naval capabilities during the Tyre siege reflected Alexander's recognition that effective operations against maritime powers require control of sea lanes and the ability to project power from naval platforms. The assembly of a fleet numbering over 200 ships, contributed by Phoenician cities that had submitted to Macedonian authority and Greek allies from throughout the eastern Mediterranean, provided the naval strength necessary to challenge Tyrian maritime supremacy while supporting the land-based siege operations. The naval battles fought during the Tyre siege demonstrated the tactical complexity of ancient maritime warfare and the challenges involved in coordinating land and sea operations against a sophisticated opponent. Tyrian ships, renowned throughout the Mediterranean for their design and crew quality, employed ramming tactics and missile attacks designed to disable Macedonian vessels while maintaining their own freedom of movement. The confined waters around Tyre created tactical conditions that favored defenders familiar with local currents and underwater obstacles, while challenging attacking forces operating in unfamiliar environments. Alexander's personal leadership during the final assault on Tyre revealed both tactical innovation and psychological understanding of the factors that determined siege warfare outcomes. Rather than simply overwhelming the defenders through superior numbers, Alexander coordinated multiple simultaneous attacks designed to stretch Tyrian defensive capabilities beyond their limits while preventing effective response to any single threat. The assault combined naval attacks against the harbor fortifications, artillery bombardment of the walls, and infantry assaults via the completed causeway in a demonstration of combined arms coordination that exceeded anything previously seen in ancient warfare. The fall of Tyre after 7 months of siege operations provided Alexander with control over the most important naval base in the eastern Mediterranean while demonstrating Macedonian capabilities to audiences throughout the Persian Empire. The city's wealth, accumulated through centuries of commercial dominance, provided enormous resources for continuing the campaign, while its strategic position ensured Macedonian control over crucial maritime trade routes. The siege's duration and complexity had also provided invaluable experience in coordinated operations involving multiple military specialties, lessons that would prove crucial in subsequent campaigns. The treatment of Tyre's population after the city's capture reflected both the anger generated by prolonged resistance and Alexander's calculated use of terror, as a political weapon. The systematic execution of military-age males and the enslavement of women and children created an example that would influence the decisions of other cities facing Macedonian siege operations, while satisfying his army's demands for compensation after months of dangerous and exhausting work. The scale of the punishment, involving approximately 30,000 people, demonstrated Alexander's willingness to employ extreme measures when he perceived challenges to his authority. The advance into Egypt proceeded with remarkable ease as Persian resistance collapsed throughout the Nile Delta, and Darius's satrap Mazaces offered submission without attempting organized defense. The Persian Empire's weakness in Egypt reflected both the unpopularity of Persian rule among the native Egyptian population and the strategic impossibility of defending the territory after the loss of naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian priests and nobles, who had chafed under Persian religious policies and administrative practices, welcomed Alexander as a liberator who might restore traditional Egyptian autonomy and religious practices. Alexander's approach to Egyptian administration demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the political and religious factors that influence popular loyalty in complex societies with ancient traditions and distinctive cultural identities. Rather than imposing Macedonian governmental structures or attempting to suppress Egyptian religious practices, Alexander adopted the traditional pharaonic titles and participated in established religious ceremonies that legitimized his authority according to Egyptian political traditions. His consultation with Egyptian priests and adoption of pharaonic regalia created powerful symbolic connections with native traditions while maintaining practical control through Macedonian military forces and administrators. The journey to the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa Oasis represented one of Alexander's most personally significant expeditions, as the consultation with this ancient deity provided both religious legitimacy and psychological reinforcement for his increasingly grandiose conception of his own destiny. The oracle's location, approximately 300 miles west of the Nile, through some of the world's most challenging desert terrain, required careful logistical planning and demonstrated Alexander's willingness to accept personal risks for spiritual and political objectives that transcended immediate military necessity. The consultation with the Oracle of Ammon provided Alexander with religious confirmation of his divine parentage and destiny, claims that would influence both his personal psychology and his political relationships throughout the remainder of his reign. The oracle's pronouncement that Alexander was the son of Zeus Ammon created powerful legitimacy among both Greek and Egyptian audiences, while establishing precedents for the divine honors that would become increasingly important in his later administration. The specific details of the consultation remained secret, but Alexander's subsequent behavior suggested that the experience had profound impact on his conception of his own nature and destiny. The foundation of Alexandria represented Alexander's most ambitious urban development project and demonstrated his vision for creating permanent centers of Hellenistic culture that would survive his military conquests while serving as administrative and commercial hubs for his expanding empire. The city's location on the Mediterranean coast near the western mouth of the Nile Delta provided access to both Egyptian agricultural resources and maritime trade networks, while offering defensive advantages through its position on elevated ground between Lake Mareotis and the sea. The planning and construction of Alexandria revealed Alexander's sophisticated understanding of urban design principles and the economic factors that determined city success in the ancient world. The city's grid pattern, wide boulevards, and carefully planned harbor facilities reflected Greek architectural traditions, while incorporating innovations designed to accommodate the specific requirements of a major commercial and administrative center. The project's scale, involving the planned settlement of several 100,000 people, exceeded anything previously attempted in the ancient world, while creating a model for subsequent Hellenistic urban foundations. The recruitment of settlers for Alexandria drew from throughout Alexander's expanding empire, creating a cosmopolitan population that combined Greek colonists, Egyptian natives, Jewish communities, and other ethnic groups in an unprecedented experiment in multicultural urban development. The city's governmental structure reflected this diversity while maintaining Greek political traditions and Macedonian administrative control. The foundation established precedents for cultural fusion and administrative innovation that would influence the development of Hellenistic civilization throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The strategic pause in Egypt provided Alexander's army with crucial rest and reorganization opportunities, while the king consolidated his political position and prepared for the decisive campaign against Darius's reconstituted forces in Mesopotamia. Intelligence reports indicated that the Persian king had assembled an even larger army than the force defeated at Issus, with contingents drawn from the empire's eastern satrapies and specialized units, including war elephants and scythe chariots. The coming confrontation would determine whether Alexander could maintain his momentum against the full resources of the Persian Empire, or whether Darius could exploit his numerical advantages to reverse the tide of conquest. The Persian Empire's administrative heartland lay exposed before Alexander's advancing army, as Darius III fled eastward from the catastrophic defeat at Gaugamela, abandoning not only his military forces, but the ceremonial centers that had symbolized Persian imperial power for over 2 centuries. The road to Babylon stretched across the fertile Mesopotamian plains, where irrigation canals dating to Hammurabi's reign still channeled the waters of the Euphrates and Tigris through agricultural districts that had fed empires since the dawn of recorded history. Persian officials in the great cities faced impossible choices as reports arrived of their king's flight and the systematic collapse of resistance throughout the western satrapies. Moses, the satrap of Babylonia who had commanded the right wing of Darius's army at Gaugamela, reached Babylon ahead of Alexander's forces and made the pragmatic decision that would preserve both his city and his own political future. Rather than attempting a futile defense that would result in the destruction of one of the ancient world's greatest urban centers, Moses dispatched envoys to meet Alexander while he was still several days' march from the city walls. The satrap's submission included not only the formal surrender of Babylon, but also detailed information about the city's defenses, treasury contents, and administrative systems that would prove invaluable for the transition to Macedonian control. The Macedonian army's approach to Babylon created scenes of unprecedented spectacle as Alexander orchestrated his entry to maximize both political impact and religious legitimacy among the diverse populations of Mesopotamia. The procession that wound through the city's massive gates included not only the disciplined formations of the phalanx and companion cavalry, but also captured Persian royal regalia, tribute bearers from conquered territories, and exotic animals that demonstrated the geographic scope of Alexander's conquests. Babylonian priests, recognizing the political realities of the new situation, participated in elaborate ceremonies that presented Alexander as the legitimate successor to Nebuchadnezzar and the other great kings who had ruled from this ancient capital. The wealth discovered in Babylon's treasury exceeded even Alexander's expectations, with gold and silver reserves totaling approximately 50,000 talents accumulated through centuries of tribute collection from throughout the Persian Empire. This enormous concentration of precious metal provided the financial foundation for Alexander's subsequent campaigns, while demonstrating the sophisticated fiscal systems that had sustained Persian imperial administration. The treasury's contents included not only bullion, but also elaborate ceremonial objects, precious stones, and artistic works that represented the cultural achievements of civilizations spanning 3 millennia of Near Eastern history. Alexander's administrative decisions regarding Babylon revealed his evolving approach to governing the diverse populations and complex political structures that characterized the Persian Empire. Rather than appointing a Macedonian governor to replace Macedonia directly, Alexander retained the Persian satrap in his position, while establishing a parallel command structure that ensured Macedonian control over military forces and key policy decisions. This arrangement preserved administrative continuity while preventing the development of independent power bases that might challenge royal authority, creating a model that would be adapted throughout the conquered territories. The integration of Babylonian religious traditions into Alexander's expanding imperial ideology demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the political importance of religious legitimacy in ancient Near Eastern societies. The king participated in traditional ceremonies honoring Marduk and other Babylonian deities, while commissioning restoration work on temples that had been neglected during the later Persian period. These actions created powerful symbolic connections with Mesopotamian political traditions, while positioning Alexander as a pious ruler who respected local customs rather than a foreign conqueror imposing alien practices. The march from Babylon to Susa proceeded through terrain that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires for over 3,000 years, as Alexander's forces followed ancient routes that connected the Mesopotamian heartland with the Iranian plateau. Persian resistance had effectively collapsed throughout the region, with local governors either fleeing eastward with Darius or submitting to Macedonian authority, as Alexander's reputation for both military effectiveness and administrative competence spread throughout the empire. The systematic nature of this collapse reflected not only military defeat, but also the Persian Empire's fundamental weakness in maintaining loyalty among diverse subject populations. Susa's surrender proceeded even more smoothly than Babylon's submission, as the city's Persian garrison abandoned their positions without attempting resistance, while the royal treasurer Abulites formally transferred control of the administrative center that had served as the Persian Empire's winter capital. The wealth accumulated in Susa's treasury, totaling approximately 40,000 talents, included not only Persian royal treasures, but also tribute payments from throughout the empire and artistic works representing the cultural achievements of conquered peoples. Among the most symbolically significant discoveries were the bronze statues of Harmodius and Aristogiton, the Athenian tyrannicides, which had been carried off during Xerxes' invasion of Greece over a century and a half earlier. The administrative complexity revealed in Susa's archives provided Alexander with unprecedented insights into the Persian Empire's governmental systems and the challenges involved in managing territories spanning 3 continents. Persian record-keeping, conducted in multiple languages including Old Persian, Elamite, and Aramaic, documented tribute obligations, military recruitment quotas, and administrative correspondence that revealed both the empire's vast resources and the sophisticated bureaucratic systems necessary to coordinate activities across such enormous distances. The archives contain detailed information about provincial revenues, population estimates, and strategic resources that would prove invaluable for Alexander's subsequent administrative reforms. Alexander's decision to continue immediately toward Persepolis rather than pausing for extended consolidation in Susa reflected both strategic urgency and symbolic calculation about the political impact of capturing the Persian Empire's ceremonial heart. Persepolis represented not only enormous material wealth, but also the spiritual and cultural center of Persian imperial ideology, where the kings of kings had received tribute from subject peoples and conducted the religious ceremonies that legitimized their universal dominion. The city's capture would provide definitive proof of Persian imperial collapse while establishing Alexander's claim to legitimate succession. The winter march through the Zagros Mountains toward Persepolis tested the Macedonian army's endurance and logistical capabilities as they negotiated mountain passes blocked by snow while facing harassment from local tribes who had maintained independence throughout centuries of Persian rule. The Uksi, a mountain people who had traditionally extracted tribute from travelers using the main routes between Mesopotamia and Persia, attempted to impose their customary fees on Alexander's army, but discovered that the Macedonian king possessed neither the patience nor the diplomatic inclination to negotiate with what he considered brigands and bandits. The campaign against the Uksi demonstrated Alexander's tactical flexibility and his army's capability to conduct effective operations in extremely challenging terrain conditions. Rather than accepting the delays and costs that would result from paying tribute or negotiating alternative routes, Alexander divided his forces to conduct simultaneous attacks against Uksi positions from multiple directions while coordinating movements through terrain that required detailed reconnaissance and precise timing. The operation's success resulted from the superior training and discipline that distinguished Alexander's forces from traditional armies, while demonstrating his personal leadership capabilities in situations that demanded both tactical innovation and physical courage. The approach to Persepolis revealed the ceremonial capital in all its architectural magnificence, with massive stone platforms supporting elaborate palaces and audience halls that had hosted the greatest rulers of the ancient world for over 2 centuries. The city's position on elevated ground overlooking the Marv Plain provided both defensive advantages and symbolic elevation that reinforced the Persian king's claims to universal dominion. The complex included not only royal residences, but also administrative buildings, treasuries, and religious structures that represented the architectural and artistic achievements of the Persian Empire at its cultural zenith. Tiridates, the Persian official responsible for Persepolis administration, made the same pragmatic calculation as his counterparts in Babylon and Susa, recognizing that resistance would result in the city's destruction, while submission offered possibilities for preserving both the architectural monuments and the lives of their inhabitants. The formal surrender ceremony conducted at the city's gates included the transfer of keys to the treasury buildings and detailed inventories of their contents, demonstrating the sophisticated administrative systems that had managed the empire's vast wealth accumulation over multiple generations. The treasury of Persepolis contained the largest concentration of precious metal ever assembled in the ancient world, with gold and silver reserves totaling approximately 120,000 talents that represented tribute payments from throughout the Persian Empire accumulated over decades of imperial administration. The wealth included not only bullion, but also elaborate ceremonial objects, jewelry, precious stones, and artistic works that demonstrated the cultural sophistication and economic power that had sustained Persian dominance throughout the Near East. The practical challenges of transporting such enormous quantities of treasure required the recruitment of thousands of pack animals and the development of new logistical systems capable of managing convoys that stretched for miles across difficult terrain. Alexander's initial restraint in his treatment of Persepolis reflected both practical considerations about maintaining administrative continuity and strategic thinking about the political implications of his actions for Persian public opinion throughout the empire. The king established his headquarters in the royal palace, while maintaining the existing administrative systems and protecting the civilian population from the looting and violence that typically accompanied the capture of major cities. This approach demonstrated respect for Persian cultural achievements while preserving the governmental apparatus necessary for continued imperial administration. However, the famous burning of Persepolis royal palace complex represented one of the most controversial episodes of Alexander's entire reign, combining calculated political symbolism with personal psychology in ways that have generated scholarly debate for over 2 millennia. The destruction occurred during a banquet celebrating the capture of the Persian ceremonial capital, when Alexander and his companions had consumed substantial quantities of wine while discussing the symbolic significance of their conquest and its relationship to the Persian invasions of Greece that had occurred over a century and a half earlier. The immediate catalyst for the palace burning involved Thais, an Athenian courtesan accompanying the Macedonian court, who reportedly suggested that destroying Persepolis would provide fitting revenge for Xerxes' destruction of Athens during the Persian Wars. Whether this suggestion represented spontaneous, drunken inspiration or carefully orchestrated theater designed to provide Alexander with political cover for a premeditated decision remains unclear, but the proposal resonated powerfully with the assembled Macedonians, who had been raised on stories of Persian sacrilege and Greek resistance. The fire that consumed Persepolis royal buildings spread rapidly through structures built primarily of cedar and other combustible materials, creating a conflagration visible throughout the surrounding plain while generating smoke columns that could be seen for dozens of miles. The destruction included not only the ceremonial halls where Persian kings had received tribute from subject peoples, but also libraries containing administrative records and literary works representing centuries of Persian cultural development. The symbolic impact of this destruction resonated throughout the ancient world as definitive proof that the empire's power had been permanently broken. Alexander's subsequent regret over the palace burning, recorded by multiple ancient sources, reflected both the political complications created by the destruction and his evolving understanding of the requirements for governing Persian territories effectively. The elimination of Persepolis as a functioning administrative center created practical problems for imperial governance, while generating resentment among Persian elites who interpreted the destruction as evidence of Macedonian barbarism rather than justified revenge. The episode demonstrated the tensions between Alexander's Greek identity and his imperial ambitions, conflicts that would intensify as his campaigns progressed deeper into the Persian heartland. The administrative challenges of governing territories spanning 3 continents, with populations numbering in the tens of millions, required governmental innovations that went far beyond traditional Macedonian political structures. The Persian Empire's diversity included not only different ethnic groups and languages, but also varying legal systems, religious traditions, economic structures, and political institutions that had developed over centuries of regional autonomy under imperial oversight. Alexander's administrators faced the enormous task of creating unified policies that could function effectively across this diversity, while maintaining the loyalty of subject populations and the efficiency of tribute collection. Alexander's adoption of Persian court customs and governmental practices represented both practical necessity and symbolic statement about his evolving conception of kingship and imperial authority. The Persian court ceremonial, including the elaborate dress, prostration rituals, and hierarchical protocols that had developed over centuries of imperial administration, provided established frameworks for managing relationships between the king and his diverse subjects. Prostration before the king created immediate controversy among Alexander's Macedonian companions, who interpreted the ritual as incompatible with Greek traditions of political equality among free citizens. The practice's religious dimensions, which implied the king's divine or semi-divine nature, conflicted with traditional Macedonian concepts of monarchy that emphasized the ruler's role as first among equals, rather than a divinely appointed autocrat. The resistance to proskynesis from figures like Callisthenes reflected broader tensions between Macedonian political traditions and the requirements of governing a vast multicultural empire. The conspiracy of Philotas emerged from these broader tensions between traditional Macedonian values and imperial necessities, as Alexander's adoption of Persian practices and his increasingly autocratic behavior created resentment among Macedonian nobles, who had expected to share power as partners in conquest rather than subjects in an Oriental despotism. Philotas, the son of Parmenion and commander of the Companion cavalry, represented the old Macedonian military aristocracy that had supported Philip's expansion, but now found itself marginalized by Alexander's imperial ambitions and cultural adaptations. The specific charges against Philotas involve his alleged knowledge of a plot against Alexander's life, organized by a group of young Macedonian nobles led by Dimnus, who had reportedly recruited accomplices through personal relationships and shared grievances against the king's evolving policies. Whether Philotas possessed actual foreknowledge of the conspiracy or simply failed to report rumors and speculation that he should have taken more seriously remains unclear, but Alexander's reaction to the accusations revealed his growing paranoia and his willingness to eliminate potential threats regardless of their actual danger to his security. The trial of Philotas before the Macedonian army assembly followed traditional procedures that required the accused to defend himself before his peers, but the proceedings were heavily influenced by Alexander's personal presentation of the evidence and his interpretation of Philotas's behavior. The king's speech to the assembly emphasized both the specific charges against Philotas and broader themes about loyalty, duty, and the dangers of internal subversion that could destroy the expedition's achievements. The assembly's vote for conviction and execution reflected both the evidence presented and the political pressures created by Alexander's personal involvement in the prosecution. The execution of Parmenion, ordered immediately after Philotas's conviction, represented one of Alexander's most ruthless political calculations and demonstrated his understanding that half measures in eliminating potential opposition could create greater dangers than decisive action. Parmenion, who commanded Macedonian forces in Media while Alexander campaigned in Persia, possessed both the military reputation and loyal following that could make him a focal point for opposition to the king's policies. His elimination, carried out by trusted agents who delivered forged letters containing execution orders, removed the most credible alternative leader while sending clear messages about the consequences of disloyalty. The broader implications of the Philotas affair extended far beyond the immediate participants, as Alexander's actions demonstrated his transformation from a Macedonian king ruling through consultation with noble companions to an autocratic emperor who would tolerate no challenges to his authority. The episode marked a decisive break with traditional Macedonian political practices while establishing precedents for the surveillance and elimination of potential opponents that would characterize the remainder of his reign. The psychological impact on surviving Macedonian nobles created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that fundamentally altered the expedition's internal dynamics. Alexander's integration policies reflected his recognition that effective imperial administration required the cooperation of Persian elites and the gradual fusion of Macedonian and Persian governmental systems. The recruitment of Persian nobles into administrative positions provided both practical expertise and symbolic demonstration of imperial inclusivity, while creating incentives for cooperation among populations that might otherwise organize resistance movements. These appointments required careful balance between providing meaningful authority and maintaining ultimate Macedonian control over crucial policy decisions. The training of Persian youth in Macedonian military techniques represented one of Alexander's most ambitious integration projects, as 30,000 young Persians received instruction in phalanx tactics, weapons handling, and military discipline according to Macedonian standards. This program, which required several years of training, created a new military force that combined Persian manpower with Macedonian tactical expertise while providing career opportunities for young Persians who might otherwise join resistance movements. The trainees, known as the epigone or successors, represented Alexander's vision for a truly integrated imperial army that could maintain control over vast territories through shared loyalty rather than ethnic dominance. The mass marriage ceremony at Susa in 324 BCE represented the culmination of Alexander's integration policies and his most dramatic attempt to create lasting bonds between Macedonian and Persian elites. The ceremony, which united 91 Macedonian officers with Persian noble women in elaborate festivities that lasted for days, combined political calculation with cultural symbolism in an unprecedented experiment in imperial fusion. Alexander himself married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, while also taking Perdiccas, the daughter of Artaxerxes III, creating direct dynastic connections with the Persian royal house. The Susa marriages reflected Alexander's understanding that lasting imperial control required more than military occupation, as the creation of family relationships between conquerors and conquered could generate loyalties that transcended ethnic divisions, while producing future generations with stakes in the empire's continued success. The ceremony's elaborate nature, which included substantial dowries provided by Alexander and festivities that honored both Greek and Persian wedding traditions, demonstrated respect for Persian customs while creating powerful incentives for cooperation among the newly connected families. The adoption of Persian dress and protocol by Alexander and his court represented both practical adaptation to local conditions and symbolic statement about the nature of his imperial authority. Persian royal garments, including the distinctive upright tiara, flowing robes, and ceremonial jewelry that had distinguished Persian kings for centuries, provided immediate visual recognition of legitimate authority among Persian subjects while demonstrating continuity with established imperial traditions. The gradual adoption of these practices by Macedonian courtiers created a distinctive court culture that blended Greek and Persian elements in unprecedented combinations. However, the cultural transformation of Alexander's court also generated increasing tensions with Macedonian soldiers and officers who interpreted these changes as evidence of their king's corruption by Oriental luxury and his abandonment of the Greek values that had justified the expedition's original objectives. The mutiny at Opus in 324 BCE revealed the depth of these concerns as veteran Macedonian soldiers openly challenged Alexander's policies while demanding recognition of their service and respect for their traditional relationship with their king. The confrontation demonstrated the fundamental contradictions between Alexander's imperial ambitions and the cultural foundations of his military power. The Hindu Kush Mountains presented Alexander with geographical challenges that dwarfed anything his army had previously encountered, as the towering peaks and treacherous passes required navigation through terrain where altitude sickness, avalanches, and extreme weather conditions could prove as deadly as any human enemy. The range's name, meaning Hindu killer in Persian, reflected centuries of experience with the difficulties of crossing these formidable barriers that separated the plateau from the Indian subcontinent. Persian administrative records captured at Persepolis had provided detailed information about the routes and seasonal conditions necessary for successful passage, but theoretical knowledge proved inadequate preparation for the physical realities of moving 35,000 men with their equipment and supplies through passes that reached elevations exceeding 15,000 feet. The campaign against the Bactrian and Sogdian territories that controlled access to these mountain passes had revealed the extraordinary difficulties involved in governing Central Asian populations, whose nomadic traditions and decentralized political structures made them fundamentally different from the Urbanese societies that Alexander had previously conquered. Bessus, the former satrap of Bactria, who had proclaimed himself successor to Darius III, had established his authority over tribal confederations that could field thousands of mounted archers while maintaining the mobility necessary to avoid decisive engagement with Macedonian forces. The pursuit of Bessus through the deserts and oases of Transoxiana had required tactical adaptations that pushed Alexander's army to the limits of its endurance, while demonstrating the challenges of projecting power across the vast distances that characterized Central Asian warfare. The fortress cities of Bactria and Sogdiana, built on nearly impregnable rocky outcrops that commanded crucial river valleys and trade routes, had tested every aspect of Macedonian siege warfare capabilities while revealing the sophisticated defensive techniques developed by populations who had resisted Persian, Scythian, and other invaders for centuries. The siege of the Sogdian Rock, where Argead had established a stronghold on a precipitous cliff that seemed to offer absolute security against conventional assault, required innovations in mountaineering and siege engineering that exceeded anything previously attempted in ancient warfare. Macedonian soldiers had scaled vertical rock faces during winter conditions, while carrying equipment necessary to establish positions from which they could threaten the defenders, demonstrating both individual courage and collective discipline that enabled seemingly impossible tactical achievements. The capture of Roxanne during the Sogdian Rock Siege had provided Alexander with both a political prize and personal fascination that would influence his subsequent decisions about Central Asian administration and his own cultural identity. Argead's daughter possessed the beauty and intelligence that made her a suitable bride for a king, but her capture also represented symbolic mastery over the fierce independence that characterized Sogdian resistance to foreign domination. Alexander's decision to marry Roxanne reflected both diplomatic calculation about securing local alliances and personal attraction that demonstrated his susceptibility to influences that his Macedonian companions viewed with increasing concern. The administrative challenges of governing Bactria and Sogdiana required innovations that went beyond the relatively straightforward adaptations that had proven successful in governing Urbani's territories with established governmental structures. The nomadic and semi-nomadic populations that dominated these regions possessed military capabilities that made them dangerous enemies but valuable allies, as their mounted archery skills and knowledge of local terrain could provide crucial advantages in the type of warfare that characterized Central Asian conflicts. Alexander's establishment of new cities throughout the region, including Alexandria Escate at the furthest northeastern frontier, represented attempts to create fixed administrative centers that could project Macedonian authority while providing secure bases for military operations against unconquered territories. The recruitment of Central Asian cavalry units into Alexander's army reflected his recognition that effective operations in the Indian subcontinent would require military capabilities specifically adapted to local conditions and fighting techniques. Bactrian and Sogdian horsemen brought skills in mounted archery, desert navigation, and high-altitude warfare that complemented the traditional strengths of Macedonian heavy cavalry, while providing tactical flexibility necessary for operations in unfamiliar terrain. The integration of these units required careful attention to command structures and cultural sensitivities, as the fierce independence that made Central Asian warriors valuable in combat also made them potential sources of internal conflict within the army's established hierarchy. The crossing of the Hindu Kush in early 327 BCE proceeded through the Kawak Pass, a route that required 15 days of marching through snow-covered terrain, with a thin air at extreme altitude, exhausted men and animals, while creating conditions where minor injuries or illnesses could prove fatal. The logistical preparations for this crossing had required months of accumulating supplies and equipment specifically designed for mountain warfare, including specialized clothing, climbing gear, and provisions that could sustain the army during periods when local resources would be unavailable. The Macedonian quartermasters had studied Persian administrative records and consulted with local guides to identify supply depots and staging areas. But the actual experience of moving such a large force through terrain that challenged individual survival demonstrated the limitations of even the most careful planning. The descent from the Hindu Kush into the Kabul Valley revealed landscapes and populations that represented Alexander's first direct encounter with Indian civilization, as the region's Buddhist monasteries, Hindu temples, and urban centers reflected cultural traditions that differed fundamentally from anything the Macedonians had previously experienced. The cities of Gandhara, with their distinctive architectural styles that blended Greek, Persian, and Indian influences, demonstrated the cosmopolitan character of regions that had served as crossroads for trade and cultural exchange between the Mediterranean world and the Indian subcontinent for centuries. The local rulers' reception of Alexander's forces revealed sophisticated diplomatic traditions and political calculations that reflected deep understanding of the changing balance of power created by the Persian Empire's collapse. Taxiles, the ruler of Taxila, who controlled one of the most important cities in the northwestern Indian subcontinent, made the strategic decision to ally with Alexander rather than resist the Macedonian advance. Recognizing both the military realities demonstrated by the conquest of the Persian Empire and the political opportunities created by the arrival of a powerful new force in regional conflicts. Taxila's position as a major center of learning and commerce made it crucial for controlling access routes between Central Asia and the Gangetic Plain, while its wealth and population provided resources that could significantly enhance Alexander's capabilities for further operations in India. Taxila's submission included not only formal recognition of Macedonian authority, but also detailed intelligence about the political landscape throughout the Indian subcontinent and the military capabilities of potential opponents. The political complexity of the Indian subcontinent far exceeded anything Alexander had encountered in his previous conquests, as dozens of independent kingdoms, tribal confederations, and city-states maintained shifting alliances and conflicts that created opportunities for external intervention, while presenting enormous challenges for anyone attempting to establish lasting control over the entire region. The absence of a unified imperial structure comparable to the Persian Empire meant that victory over individual rulers would not automatically result in submission by their neighbors, while the diversity of political systems, religious traditions, and military capabilities required separate tactical and diplomatic approaches for each potential opponent. The kingdom of Porus, situated between the Hydaspes and Assassins rivers in what is now the Punjab region, represented one of the most formidable military challenges that Alexander would face during his entire career, as the Indian king commanded not only substantial numbers of well-trained infantry and cavalry, but also war elephants whose psychological and tactical impact on troops unfamiliar with these animals could prove decisive in battle. Porus himself, described by ancient sources as exceptionally tall and powerful, possessed both personal courage and strategic acumen that made him a dangerous opponent who would not be intimidated by Alexander's reputation or overawed by Macedonian military techniques that had proven effective against different types of enemies. The war elephants that formed the core of Porus's capabilities represented a completely new tactical challenge for Alexander's forces, as these massive animals could charge through infantry formations while carrying towers containing archers who could deliver devastating missile fire from elevated positions. The elephant's thick skin provided natural armor that could resist most conventional weapons, while their size and strength made them capable of trampling infantry or overturning cavalry horses whose riders lacked experience in elephant warfare. The psychological impact of these animals on troops who had never encountered them in combat could prove as important as their physical capabilities, as horses typically panicked when confronted by elephants, while soldiers might break formation, rather than face creatures that seemed immune to normal military techniques. The Hydaspes River, swollen by monsoon rains to a width of nearly half a mile with swift currents that made crossing operations extremely dangerous, provided Porus with a natural defensive barrier that he could exploit to neutralize many of Alexander's tactical advantages while maximizing the effectiveness of his own forces. The Indian king's deployment along the eastern bank positioned his elephants where they could charge any Macedonian troops attempting to establish bridgeheads, while his archers and cavalry could attack crossing forces when they were most vulnerable. The river's depth and current made it impossible for the Macedonian phalanx to maintain formation integrity during crossing operations, potentially negating the disciplined coordination that had proven decisive in previous battles. Alexander's solution to the tactical challenges posed by the Hydaspes crossing demonstrated tactical innovation and strategic deception that represented the culmination of his military development, as he employed multiple feints and diversionary operations to conceal his actual crossing point while creating conditions that would allow his forces to engage Porus's army on favorable terms. The operation required precise coordination between different units operating at widely separated locations while maintaining absolute secrecy about the timing and location of the main assault. Macedonian engineers constructed boats and rafts using materials transported across the Hindu Kush specifically for river crossing operations, while cavalry units conducted demonstrations at various points along the river to convince Porus that Alexander might attempt to force a crossing at any of several locations. The actual crossing took place approximately 18 miles upstream from Porus's main positions, where a large island provided concealment for Alexander's preparations while offering a staging area that could support complex amphibious operations. The selection of this crossing point required detailed reconnaissance of river conditions, current patterns, and terrain features that could influence the operation's success, while the movement of troops and equipment to the crossing site demanded careful attention to maintaining secrecy while ensuring that all necessary resources would be available when needed. The crossing force included approximately 11,000 men, representing a substantial portion of Alexander's army, but not so large as to make the operation unwieldy or impossible to conceal from enemy observation. The night crossing proceeded through torrential rain and darkness that provided concealment while creating additional dangers for troops attempting to navigate swift currents in unfamiliar terrain. Alexander personally led the crossing in the first boats, while his engineers managed the complex logistics of transporting cavalry horses, siege equipment, and supplies across water that could easily swamp overloaded vessels or sweep away soldiers who lost their footing. The operation's success depended on precise timing and coordination between multiple elements, as delays or confusion could result in the crossing force being destroyed piecemeal while attempting to establish positions on the eastern bank. The discovery of Alexander's successful crossing forced Porus to abandon his defensive positions along the river and march rapidly to intercept the Macedonian force before it could be reinforced or establish secure positions in favorable terrain. The Indian king's response demonstrated both tactical flexibility and personal courage, as he recognized that allowing Alexander to consolidate his bridgehead would create insurmountable strategic disadvantages, while offering battle-provided opportunities to exploit the Macedonian force's isolation from its main army. Porus's decision to commit his entire army to this engagement reflected confidence in his military capabilities and understanding that decisive action offered better prospects than defensive measures that would allow Alexander to dictate the campaign's subsequent development. The Battle of the Hydaspes began at dawn, with Porus's war elephants advancing against Alexander's cavalry in a demonstration of the tactical challenges that these animals presented to conventional military formations. The elephant's charge created immediate chaos among the Macedonian horses, which had never encountered such creatures and reacted with panic that threatened to disrupt the entire cavalry formation. Alexander's response to this crisis revealed both tactical adaptation and personal leadership, as he recognized that traditional cavalry techniques would prove ineffective against elephants while understanding that his army's morale depended on demonstrating that these seemingly invincible creatures could be defeated through appropriate tactics. The Macedonian infantry's encounter with war elephants required immediate tactical innovations that drew upon their training and discipline while adapting to completely unfamiliar combat conditions. The phalangites discovered that their sarissas could wound elephants if concentrated against vulnerable areas such as the eyes and trunk, while coordinated attacks by multiple soldiers could hamstring the animals or attack their handlers. The development of these techniques proceeded through trial and error during the battle itself, as Macedonian soldiers learned, through direct experience, how to counter weapons that no military manual had ever described. Alexander's personal leadership during the elephant combat demonstrated both physical courage and tactical understanding, as he led cavalry charges designed to isolate individual elephants while coordinating infantry attacks that could exploit the confusion created by mounted operations. The king's willingness to expose himself to extreme danger while developing new tactical methods provided crucial psychological leadership for troops who might otherwise have been overwhelmed by the unprecedented nature of their opponents. The successful neutralization of Porus's elephants required sustained coordination between different military units operating according to improvised tactics that had never been tested in previous engagements. The decisive phase of the battle developed when Alexander's tactical innovations against the war elephants created opportunities for his traditional military strengths to achieve decisive results against Porus's disrupted formations. The companion cavalry, once they had adapted to fighting in proximity to elephants, could exploit gaps created in the Indian line while the phalanx advanced against infantry formations that had lost their coordination due to the confusion surrounding the elephant combat. The integration of these conventional tactics with the impromptu anti-elephant techniques demonstrated the tactical flexibility and adaptability that characterized Alexander's military system at its most effective. Porus's personal conduct during the battle earned Alexander's respect and admiration, as the Indian king continued fighting even after sustaining multiple wounds while his army disintegrated around him. The Indian ruler's refusal to surrender despite hopeless tactical circumstances demonstrated the type of heroic leadership that Alexander valued above all other qualities, while his dignified behavior during capture provided opportunities for the political accommodation that could transform a dangerous enemy into a valuable ally. The famous exchange between Alexander and Porus, in which the captured king requested to be treated as a king should treat another king, established the foundation for a relationship that would prove crucial for Alexander's subsequent operations in India. Alexander's decision to restore Porus to his throne while expanding his territorial control represented sophisticated political calculation about the requirements for governing Indian territories effectively. The retention of Porus as a client king provided Alexander with an ally who possessed detailed knowledge of local conditions and established relationships with neighboring rulers, while the expansion of Porus's kingdom created incentives for continued loyalty and cooperation. This arrangement also demonstrated to other Indian rulers that submission to Alexander could result in enhanced status and territorial gains rather than the loss of independence and dignity that they might otherwise expect from foreign conquest. The army's reaction to the Hydaspes' victory revealed growing concerns about the expedition's direction and the physical and psychological costs of continuous campaigning in unfamiliar territories against increasingly exotic opponents. While the soldiers celebrated their tactical success and marveled at the wealth and strange customs of their Indian captives, many also expressed private doubts about the wisdom of advancing further into regions where every battle required the development of new tactical methods, while exposing them to dangers that seemed to increase with each geographic advance. The elephant combat had demonstrated that even victory against Indian armies would require enormous effort and casualties, while the monsoon rains and tropical diseases created environmental challenges that sapped the army's strength regardless of military outcomes. The advance beyond the Hydaspes toward the Hyphasis River proceeded through territory that revealed the true scale of the Indian subcontinent and the impossibility of conquering such vast regions with the limited forces at Alexander's disposal. Intelligence reports from local sources described the Gangaridae and Perdiccas kingdoms that controlled the Gangetic Plain, with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands and elephant forces that dwarfed anything Porus had fielded. The Nanda dynasty's capital at Pataliputra reportedly contained wealth that exceeded even the Persian treasuries, but the military resources necessary to capture such prizes appeared far beyond Alexander's current capabilities. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River emerged from the convergence of multiple factors that had been building throughout the Indian campaigns, as the army's exhaustion combined with fear of the unknown dangers that lay ahead and nostalgia for the homes and families that many soldiers had not seen for nearly a decade. The veterans who served since the expedition's beginning calculated that they had already achieved wealth and glory beyond their original expectations, while the prospect of facing even larger armies with even more war elephants and territories even further from Macedonia seemed to offer diminishing returns for exponentially increasing risks. The monsoon rains that had turned the landscape into a muddy swamp while breeding diseases that killed more soldiers than enemy action provided immediate physical evidence of the environmental challenges that would only intensify as the army advanced deeper into tropical regions. The soldiers' refusal to advance beyond the Hyphasis represented the first time in Alexander's career that his personal authority and charismatic leadership had proven insufficient to overcome his army's collective resistance to his strategic objectives. The mutiny's leaders included veteran officers who had served with distinction throughout the expedition, but now concluded that further advance would result in the army's destruction through attrition, even if they achieved tactical victories against Indian opponents. Their arguments emphasized both practical considerations about logistics and casualties and emotional appeals about the soldiers' rights to return home after years of faithful service in the most demanding military operations ever attempted. Alexander's initial response to the mutiny revealed both his psychological dependence on continuous conquest and his difficulty in accepting limitations on his imperial ambitions. The king's withdrawal to his tent for 3 days, while refusing to meet with his officers or address the army's concerns, demonstrated behavior that bordered on petulance, as he attempted to use emotional manipulation and implied threats to overcome resistance that he could not counter through rational argument or military discipline. The failure of this approach forced Alexander to confront the reality that even his extraordinary leadership capabilities had limits when confronted with collective determination by subordinates who possessed both legitimate grievances and sufficient solidarity to maintain their resistance. The eventual compromise that resulted in the army's withdrawal from the Hyphasis reflected Alexander's recognition that further advance would require either the recruitment of substantial reinforcements or the development of alternative strategic approaches that could achieve his objectives through different methods. The construction of altars marking the expedition's furthest advance provided symbolic compensation for the abandonment of immediate conquest, while creating monuments that would commemorate the unprecedented geographic scope of Macedonian achievements. The decision to return to the Hydaspes and construct a fleet for operations along the Indus River system offered possibilities for continued expansion through different geographic axes while providing the army with new objectives that might restore their enthusiasm for further campaigning. The construction of the Indus fleet required engineering capabilities and logistical coordination that demonstrated the continued effectiveness of Alexander's military organization despite the psychological crisis created by the Hephaestus mutiny. Macedonian shipwrights, working with local craftsmen who possessed expertise in river navigation and boat construction techniques adapted to Indian conditions, produced vessels capable of transporting the entire army along waterways that offered access to territories that could not be reached through conventional overland marches. The fleet's construction also provided employment and purpose for soldiers whose morale had been damaged by the perceived failure of the land campaign, while creating opportunities for the type of innovative military operations that had characterized Alexander's most successful campaigns. The decision to return from India through the Etruscan desert represented one of Alexander's most catastrophic strategic miscalculations, transforming what should have been a triumphant homecoming into a nightmare of logistics and survival that would permanently damage both army morale and the empire's administrative capacity. The desert route through modern-day Balochistan appeared on Persian maps as a viable alternative to the mountain passes that had proven so treacherous during the advance into India, but these administrative documents failed to convey the true horror of attempting to move 30,000 soldiers, camp followers, and baggage animals across 200 miles of waterless wasteland where daytime temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit and sandstorms could bury entire columns without warning. Alexander's motivations for choosing this route combined practical considerations with personal psychology in ways that revealed both his strategic thinking and the dangerous overconfidence that increasingly characterized his decision-making. The king claimed he wanted to emulate Cyrus the Great and Semiramis, legendary conquerors who had reportedly attempted similar crossings with disastrous results, suggesting that success where others had failed would enhance his reputation for achieving the impossible. More pragmatically, the desert route offered possibilities for establishing supply depots that could support future operations while avoiding the political complications that might arise from retracing the army's previous path through territories where local rulers had submitted under duress rather than genuine conviction. The advanced preparations for the desert crossing revealed significant gaps between theoretical planning and practical reality, as Alexander's quartermasters struggled to accumulate sufficient water, food, and equipment for an operation that exceeded anything in their previous experience. Persian administrative records provided general information about seasonal conditions and the locations of occasional water sources, but this intelligence proved inadequate for planning the complex logistics required to sustain such a large force through terrain where a single miscalculation could result in the deaths of thousands of men. The procurement of pack animals capable of carrying heavy loads across sand dunes while surviving on minimal water and fodder required negotiations with tribal leaders throughout the region, many of whom possessed limited resources and questionable reliability. The column that entered the Gedrosian Desert in late 325 BCE stretched for miles across the barren landscape, with the army's organization reflecting both military necessity and social hierarchy, as different units received priority access to water and shade based on their importance to the expedition's survival. The companion cavalry and infantry formations marched near the front of the column, where they could access the clearest water sources and receive the best available food, while camp followers, baggage handlers, and wounded soldiers struggled along behind in conditions that grew progressively worse as the limited resources became contaminated or exhausted. The rigid enforcement of this hierarchy, necessary for maintaining military discipline and ensuring the survival of essential personnel, created resentment among the common soldiers who bore the greatest hardships while receiving the least consideration. The desert's physical challenges exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions, as the combination of extreme heat, water scarcity, and shifting sand created conditions that tested human endurance beyond its normal limits. Soldiers who'd survived the mountain warfare of Central Asia and the tropical diseases of India found themselves defeated by an environment that offered no enemies to fight and no tactical solutions to problems that required only the ability to continue walking when every instinct demanded rest. The sand burned through leather sandals and penetrated armor joints, creating wounds that became infected in the heat, while the constant glare reflected from white sand caused temporary blindness that left men stumbling into obstacles or wandering away from the column to die alone in the wasteland. Water became the expedition's most precious commodity, with strict rationing enforced by guards who faced execution if they allowed unauthorized access to the carefully hoarded supplies. The discovery of each new water source created scenes of desperate competition as soldiers fought for access to muddy pools that might sustain life for a few more days, while the failure to locate expected wells triggered panic that could only be controlled through harsh discipline and the execution of soldiers who attempted to desert or steal water from their comrades. Alexander's personal sharing of his water ration with common soldiers, dramatically pouring his portion onto the sand when insufficient quantities were available for everyone, provided powerful symbolic leadership that helped maintain army cohesion during the crisis's worst moments. The systematic breakdown of military discipline proceeded gradually as the environmental pressures exceeded the army's capacity to maintain normal organizational structures and behavioral standards. Units that had maintained perfect formation integrity during the most challenging battles began to disintegrate as soldiers abandoned heavy equipment, fell behind due to exhaustion, or simply disappeared during the night marches that provided the only relief from the desert's killing heat. Officers who attempted to maintain traditional standards found themselves commanding formations that existed only on paper, while the normal systems of supply distribution, medical care, and communication collapsed under conditions that made basic survival more important than military protocol. The human cost of the Gadrosian crossing exceeded the casualties suffered in any single battle of Alexander's career, with estimates suggesting that nearly 3/4 of the noncombatants and at least 1/4 of the soldiers died from dehydration, heat exhaustion, disease, or simple abandonment when they could no longer keep pace with the column's movement. Entire families of camp followers, including the wives and children of soldiers who'd followed the army for years, perished when the limited water supplies were reserved for military personnel. While wounded veterans who'd survived dozens of battles died because they lacked the strength to continue marching across terrain that offered no possibility of rest or recovery. The psychological impact of witnessing such massive casualties among people who had shared the expedition's dangers and victories created trauma that would affect the survivors for the remainder of their lives. Soldiers who had maintained their courage during the most desperate battles found themselves haunted by memories of abandoning comrades who begged for help that could not be provided without risking the survival of others. The moral compromises required for survival in the desert challenged fundamental assumptions about loyalty, duty, and honor that had sustained military discipline throughout the expedition, creating psychological wounds that proved as lasting as any physical injuries. The column's emergence from the Gadrosian Desert after 60 days of marching revealed the expedition's transformation from a disciplined military force into a collection of traumatized survivors whose appearance shocked even the local populations who had expected to welcome a victorious army. The soldiers who staggered into the first settlements looked more like refugees than conquerors, with their equipment lost or damaged beyond repair, their clothing reduced to rags, and their physical condition reflecting weeks of malnutrition and exposure. Alexander himself, despite his efforts to share the hardships with his men, appeared gaunt and aged in ways that suggested the psychological as well as physical toll of the crossing. The administrative chaos that followed the desert crossing revealed the expedition's dependence on organizational systems that had been devastated by the loss of personnel and equipment essential for imperial governance. The scribes, interpreters, and technical specialists who had managed the complex logistics of governing territories spanning 3 continents had suffered disproportionate casualties during the crossing, as their non-combat status provided no protection against environmental hazards that killed without regard for military rank or administrative importance. The loss of records, correspondence, and legal documents that had been abandoned during the march created immediate problems for provincial administration, while establishing precedents for the type of governmental breakdown that would characterize the empire's subsequent history. The reunion with Nearchus and the fleet that had sailed along the Indian Ocean coast provided welcome relief from the immediate survival crisis, while revealing the scale of the disaster that had befallen the land forces. The naval expedition, despite facing storms, hostile populations, and navigational challenges in unfamiliar waters, had suffered relatively minor casualties while gathering valuable intelligence about coastal geography and commercial possibilities. Nearchus' detailed reports of his voyage demonstrated the type of systematic exploration and documentation that had characterized the expedition's earlier phases, providing stark contrast with the desperate improvisation that had marked the desert crossing. The return to familiar territories in Persia and Mesopotamia should have provided opportunities for recovery and reorganization. But Alexander's discovery of widespread administrative corruption and rebellion during his absence created new crises that demanded immediate attention despite the army's weakened condition. Provincial governors who had assumed the king's death during his prolonged absence in India had begun acting as independent rulers, appropriating imperial revenues for personal use while neglecting their administrative responsibilities. Several satraps had raised private armies and established autonomous territories, creating the type of fragmented authority that had characterized the Persian Empire's decline and now threatened to destroy Alexander's imperial system before it could be fully consolidated. The systematic purge of corrupt and rebellious officials that followed Alexander's return revealed both his continued capacity for decisive action and the fundamental instability of personal rule over such vast territories. The executions of satraps like Cleander, Sitalces, and Heracon, who had abused their authority during the king's absence, demonstrated that Alexander retained sufficient military power to enforce his will despite the army's weakened condition. However, these executions also reveal the empire's dependence on Alexander's personal presence for maintaining governmental integrity, as even trusted officials had proven unable to resist the temptations created by unsupervised authority over enormous resources. The discovery that Harpalus, the imperial treasurer and one of Alexander's oldest friends, had embezzled thousands of talents while maintaining a luxurious court in Babylon, provided the most shocking evidence of the administrative breakdown that had occurred during the Indian campaigns. Harpalus' theft of imperial funds to support his extravagant lifestyle, including the maintenance of expensive courtesans and the construction of elaborate monuments to his personal glory, represented not merely financial corruption, but fundamental betrayal of the personal relationships that had sustained Alexander's authority throughout his reign. The treasurer's flight to Athens with substantial portions of the imperial treasury created immediate financial problems, while demonstrating to potential rebels that even the most trusted officials could escape punishment through careful planning and foreign connections. The integration of 30,000 Persian youths, trained in Macedonian military techniques and equipped according to Macedonian standards, into the imperial army created the most serious internal crisis of Alexander's reign, as Macedonian veterans interpreted this development as evidence of their king's intention to replace them with more compliant foreign troops. The Epigone, as these Persian soldiers were known, had spent years learning phalanx tactics, weapons handling, and military discipline under Macedonian instructors, creating a force that combined Persian manpower with Macedonian tactical expertise. Their arrival at the army's main camp near Susa, marching in perfect formation while displaying their mastery of Macedonian military techniques, provided dramatic evidence of Alexander's success in creating an integrated imperial military system. However, the Macedonian veterans' reaction to the Epigone's arrival revealed the depth of ethnic tensions and cultural resistance that Alexander's integration policies had generated among his original supporters. The soldiers who had conquered the Persian Empire interpreted the training of Persian replacements as evidence that their king no longer valued their service or trusted their loyalty, while the obvious competence of the troops suggested that Macedonian military superiority was not the unique advantage they had believed. The veterans' complaints focused not only on the immediate threat to their status, but also on broader concerns about Alexander's cultural transformation and his apparent preference for Persian customs over Macedonian traditions. The mutiny at Opus in 324 BC erupted when Alexander announced his intention to discharge the oldest and most disabled veterans while retaining the Persian troops for continued service, a decision that the Macedonian soldiers interpreted as the final confirmation of their replacement by foreign forces. The veterans' refusal to accept their discharge, despite the bonuses and honors that Alexander offered, reflected their understanding that retirement would separate them from the only community that had sustained them through years of campaigning, while leaving them vulnerable to poverty and obscurity in a Macedonia they barely remembered. Their demand to be discharged en masse, taking Alexander with them, represented both emotional appeal and calculated political pressure designed to force the king to choose between his imperial ambitions and his relationship with the soldiers who had made those ambitions possible. Alexander's response to the Opus mutiny revealed both his psychological dependence on Macedonian approval and his transformation into an autocratic ruler who would tolerate no challenges to his authority. The king's initial speech to the assembled army, cataloging his achievements and sacrifices while emphasizing the soldiers' obligations to continue serving, demonstrated his expectation that rational argument and emotional appeal would overcome resistance as they had in previous crises. However, the veterans' continued defiance forced Alexander to confront the reality that his personal charisma and military reputation could no longer guarantee obedience from subordinates who possessed their own sources of power and legitimacy. The dramatic gesture of leaping from the platform into the crowd of mutinous soldiers, calling for anyone who wished to challenge him to step forward, represented Alexander's reversion to the type of personal leadership that had characterized his early career, while revealing his inability to develop alternative methods for managing political opposition. The soldiers' stunned silence in response to this challenge reflected both their continued respect for Alexander's personal courage and their recognition that direct confrontation with their king would result in civil war that could destroy everything they had achieved together. The psychological impact of this confrontation temporarily restored Alexander's authority, while demonstrating the fragility of relationships that depended entirely on personal dominance rather than institutional structures. The reconciliation banquet that followed the Opus mutiny represented Alexander's most ambitious attempt to create lasting unity between Macedonian and Persian elements within his empire, as 9,000 participants shared food and wine while participating in religious ceremonies that honored both Greek and Persian deities. The king's prayer for partnership and shared rule between Macedonians and Persians reflected his vision of an integrated imperial system that would transcend ethnic divisions while maintaining the military effectiveness that had made conquest possible. However, The banquet's elaborate nature and symbolic importance could not address the fundamental tensions between different cultural groups whose cooperation remained dependent on Alexander's personal authority rather than shared interests or mutual respect. The discharge of 10,000 Macedonian veterans after the Opus reconciliation provided both practical relief from the immediate crisis and long-term problems for imperial administration, as the departing soldiers took with them decades of military experience and institutional knowledge that could not be easily replaced. The veterans' return to Macedonia under Craterus' command was intended to provide internal security for the kingdom while demonstrating Alexander's continued connection to his homeland. But the practical effect was to weaken the imperial army's capabilities while creating potential sources of opposition to policies that many Macedonians viewed as betrayals of their traditional values and interests. The administrative reforms that Alexander implemented during his final years reflected both his growing understanding of imperial governance requirements and his increasing isolation from the cultural foundations that had originally sustained his authority. The standardization of administrative procedures across the empire's diverse territories required the development of new governmental institutions that could function effectively regardless of local conditions or personnel changes. However, these reforms also centralized authority in ways that made the entire system dependent on Alexander's personal supervision, while creating bureaucratic structures that lacked the flexibility necessary for governing such diverse populations. The planning for new military campaigns, including projected operations against the Arabian Peninsula and possible expeditions to the Western Mediterranean, revealed Alexander's inability to accept the limitations that age, circumstances, and resources imposed on his imperial ambitions. Intelligence reports about Arabian wealth and commercial opportunities provided justification for expansion that would bring the empire's borders to the Indian Ocean, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf, creating a unified economic system that could exploit maritime trade networks throughout the ancient world. However, the military and logistical requirements for such operations exceeded the capabilities of an army that had been weakened by years of continuous campaigning and the loss of experienced personnel during the Gadrosian crossing. The construction of a massive fleet in Babylon for the projected Arabian campaign demonstrated both the empire's continued capacity for major military undertakings and the increasingly grandiose nature of Alexander's strategic planning. The assembly of ships, equipment, and personnel for operations in unfamiliar waters required coordination between different provinces and the recruitment of specialized craftsmen whose skills were essential for naval warfare in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf. However, the project's scale and complexity also revealed the enormous costs of maintaining Alexander's imperial ambitions while highlighting the dependence on his personal involvement for ensuring effective coordination between different administrative systems. Alexander's death in Babylon on June 10, 323 BCE, occurred at the moment when his empire faced its greatest internal challenges, while his personal authority remained essential for maintaining unity among competing ethnic groups, administrative systems, and military forces. The king's final illness, characterized by fever, abdominal pain, and progressive weakness over 10 days, generated immediate speculation about poison, while revealing the complete absence of succession planning that would determine the empire's future. The dramatic scenes surrounding Alexander's deathbed, with Macedonian soldiers filing past their dying king, while Persian courtiers maintained vigil according to their own traditions, symbolized both the cultural diversity that had characterized his reign and the fundamental divisions that his personal authority had temporarily suppressed. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death plunged the Macedonian Empire into chaos, as competing factions within the royal court struggled to establish control over the succession while maintaining authority over territories that stretched from Egypt to India. The absence of a clear heir created an unprecedented constitutional crisis, as Alexander's only legitimate son remained unborn in Roxanne's womb, while his mentally disabled half-brother Philip Aridaeus possessed the royal bloodline, but lacked the capacity for effective rule. The Macedonian nobles who had gathered in Babylon for the Arabian expedition found themselves forced to improvise solutions to problems that Alexander's personal authority had previously rendered irrelevant, creating precedents that would shape the political development of the Hellenistic world for the next 3 centuries. Perdiccas, who had received Alexander's signet ring during the king's final moments, claimed the right to serve as regent for the unborn heir while maintaining the empire's unity under a single authority. However, this position immediately brought him into conflict with other senior commanders who possessed their power bases and territorial ambitions. Ptolemy, the satrap of Egypt, controlled the wealthiest and most defensible province in the empire while commanding the loyalty of troops who had served under his leadership for years. Antigonus, who governed much of Asia Minor from his base in Phrygia, commanded substantial military forces while controlling territories that provided access to both European and Asian trade networks. Seleucus held Babylon and its enormous treasury, giving him financial resources that could support independent military operations, while Cassander remained in Macedonia with authority over the kingdom's traditional heartland and recruitment grounds. The first crisis emerged over the disposition of Alexander's body as Perdiccas planned to transport the corpse to Macedonia for burial in the royal tombs at Argead, while Ptolemy recognized that possession of Alexander's remains would provide enormous symbolic legitimacy for his own territorial ambitions. The construction of an elaborate funeral cart, decorated with gold and precious stones while drawn by 64 mules, created a mobile shrine that attracted crowds of worshippers throughout its journey from Babylon toward the Mediterranean coast. Ptolemy's interception of this procession in Syria represented the first open act of defiance against Perdiccas' authority while demonstrating the political value of religious symbolism in legitimizing territorial claims. The hijacking of Alexander's body triggered the First War of the Diadochi, as Perdiccas attempted to reassert his authority through military force, while his opponents formed coalitions designed to prevent any single commander from achieving the type of dominance that Alexander had exercised. The war's initial phase revealed both the continued effectiveness of Macedonian military techniques and the fundamental changes in strategic thinking that occurred when these forces were employed against each other rather than foreign enemies. The battles fought between former comrades who had shared the dangers and victories of Alexander's campaigns possessed an intensity and tactical sophistication that exceeded most previous conflicts in the ancient world. Perdiccas' invasion of Egypt in 321 BCE demonstrated both his military capabilities and the strategic challenges involved in projecting power across the vast distances that characterized the former empire. The campaign required complex logistical coordination to transport substantial forces across desert terrain, while maintaining supply lines that stretched back to Mesopotamia through territories controlled by potentially hostile governors. The Nile Delta's defensive advantages, including seasonal flooding that created natural barriers and a population that had welcomed Ptolemy's administration, provided Ptolemy with significant tactical benefits, while forcing Perdiccas to operate in unfamiliar terrain under increasingly difficult conditions. The failure of Perdiccas' Egyptian expedition, culminating in his assassination by his own officers near Memphis, marked the definitive end of unified imperial authority and the beginning of the fragmentation process that would create the major Hellenistic kingdoms. The conspiracy that eliminated Perdiccas involved senior commanders who recognized that continued civil war would destroy the military effectiveness that had made their conquest possible, while creating opportunities for subject populations to rebel against Macedonian rule. However, the removal of the last credible claimant to supreme authority also eliminated any possibility of restoring imperial unity as the surviving commanders began consolidating their territorial holdings into independent kingdoms. The partition arrangements negotiated at Perdiccas in 320 BC attempted to create a stable balance of power among the surviving diadochi, while maintaining the fiction of unified rule under the joint kingship of Philip Argead and Alexander's infant son, Alexander IV. Antipater's appointment as regent provided temporary stability in Macedonia, while Antigonus received expanded authority in Asia Minor and Syria. Ptolemy retained Egypt with recognition of his de facto independence, while Seleucus regained control of Babylon after a period of exile. However, these arrangements depended entirely on the personal agreements between commanders who possessed no institutional mechanisms for resolving future disputes or preventing territorial expansion at their neighbors' expense. The assassination of Philip Argead and his wife Eurydice in 317 BCE, ordered by Olympias during her brief return to power in Macedonia, eliminated one of the last symbols of imperial unity, while demonstrating the continued importance of the Argead bloodline for legitimizing political authority. Olympias' brutal elimination of potential rivals, including the execution of dozens of Macedonian nobles who had opposed her faction, created a reign of terror that provoked widespread resistance, while revealing the depths of hatred and ambition that Alexander's death had unleashed among his former supporters. Her subsequent defeat and execution by Cassander marked the end of direct Argead involvement in Macedonian politics, while establishing precedents for the type of dynastic violence that would characterize Hellenistic monarchy. The murder of Alexander IV in 310 BCE, carried out on Cassander's orders when a young king reached an age where he might begin asserting independent authority, marked the final extinction of Alexander's direct lineage and the formal end of any pretense that the diadochi served as regents rather than independent rulers. The boy's death, conducted in secret to avoid immediate retaliation from rival claimants, removed the last constitutional barrier to the assumption of royal titles by the surviving commanders. The psychological impact of this event resonated throughout the Hellenistic world as populations who had maintained loyalty to Alexander's memory were forced to acknowledge that his empire had been permanently divided among his former subordinates. Antigonus' attempt to restore imperial unity under his own authority triggered the coalition wars that would determine the final territorial boundaries of the major Hellenistic kingdoms. The alliance between Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander represented both shared opposition to Antigonid hegemony and recognition that successful resistance required coordinated military action across multiple theaters. The war scale exceeded anything seen since Alexander's campaigns, with battles involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, while naval operations extended throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. The Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE represented the decisive engagement of the Diadochi Wars, as the anti-Antigonid coalition concentrated overwhelming force against Antigonus and his son Demetrius in Central Asia Minor. The battle's outcome, which resulted in Antigonus' death and the destruction of his unified Asian empire, established the territorial framework that would characterize the Hellenistic world for the next century. The victory demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Macedonian military techniques and the impossibility of reunifying Alexander's empire under a single authority when multiple commanders possessed comparable resources and strategic capabilities. The establishment of the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt represented the most successful adaptation of Macedonian administrative techniques to local conditions and cultural traditions. Ptolemy's decision to establish his capital at Alexandria rather than Memphis reflected both practical considerations about maritime access and symbolic statements about the kingdom's relationship to both Greek and Egyptian traditions. The city's development into the largest urban center in the Mediterranean world demonstrated the economic advantages that could be achieved through systematic exploitation of Egypt's agricultural resources, combined with aggressive expansion of commercial networks throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Indian Ocean regions. The Ptolemaic administrative system combined Macedonian military organization with pharaonic governmental traditions and Hellenistic commercial practices in ways that created unprecedented economic prosperity while maintaining political stability for nearly 3 centuries. The kingdom's bureaucratic apparatus, staffed by Greek immigrants and educated Egyptians, developed sophisticated methods for managing agricultural production, taxation, and trade that maximized royal revenues while providing sufficient local autonomy to prevent widespread rebellion. The integration of Egyptian religious traditions with Greek cultural practices created a distinctive Ptolemaic court culture that influenced artistic and intellectual development throughout the Hellenistic world. The Seleucid Empire's vast territorial extent, stretching from Syria to Central Asia, required administrative innovations that went far beyond anything attempted by previous rulers, while creating military challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable. Seleucus' establishment of multiple capitals, including Antioch in Syria and Seleucia on the Tigris in Mesopotamia, reflected both the empire's geographic diversity and the practical impossibility of governing such vast territories from a single administrative center. The foundation of dozens of new cities throughout the empire's eastern territories provided Greek colonists with urban centers while creating networks of administrative control that could project royal authority across enormous distances. However, the Seleucid Empire's size also created fundamental weaknesses that became apparent as soon as the kingdom faced sustained military pressure from multiple directions. The loss of the eastern satrapies to Parthian expansion during the 3rd century BCE eliminated crucial sources of revenue and manpower, while creating hostile neighbors who could threaten the empire's heartland in Mesopotamia. Simultaneous pressure from Ptolemaic forces in the south, Celtic invasions in Asia Minor, and Roman expansion in the west stretched Seleucid resources beyond their capacity to maintain effective control over their remaining territories. The Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia faced different but equally serious challenges as Cassander's successors struggled to maintain control over the traditional Macedonian heartland, while projecting sufficient power to influence developments in southern Greece and Asia Minor. The kingdom's relatively small size and limited resources made it vulnerable to external pressure, while its strategic position made it a natural target for ambitious neighbors seeking to expand their territorial holdings. The frequent dynastic conflicts that characterized Antigonid history reflected both the personal rivalries inherited from the Diadochi period and the structural instability created by the kingdom's geographic and economic limitations. The cultural legacy of Alexander's empire proved more enduring than its political unity, as Greek language, artistic traditions, and intellectual practices spread throughout the territories that had been conquered by Macedonian forces. The establishment of gymnasiums, theaters, and libraries in cities from Egypt to Central Asia created networks of cultural exchange that facilitated the development of distinctively Hellenistic civilization. The fusion of Greek and local traditions produced artistic innovations, philosophical developments, and scientific achievements that would influence Mediterranean and Near Eastern culture for centuries after the political collapse of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The economic transformation of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern regions under Hellenistic rule created commercial networks that connected previously isolated markets while facilitating the exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas across vast geographic distances. The standardization of coinage, weights, and measures throughout much of the former empire reduced transaction costs, while enabling merchants to operate across political boundaries with greater efficiency than had been possible under previous political arrangements. The development of new trade routes, particularly maritime connections between the Red Sea and Indian Ocean regions, opened access to luxury goods and raw materials that had been largely unavailable to Mediterranean consumers. The gradual decline of Macedonian military effectiveness resulted from both the dilution of traditional training methods and the adaptation of Hellenistic tactical innovations by neighboring peoples who had initially been disadvantaged by their unfamiliarity with phalanx warfare. The recruitment of local populations into Hellenistic armies, while necessary for maintaining adequate force levels across vast territories, gradually reduced the proportion of soldiers who possessed the intensive training and cultural conditioning that had made the original Macedonian forces so effective. The development of new military technologies, particularly in siege warfare and cavalry tactics, also reduced the advantages that had originally given Macedonian armies decisive superiority over their opponents. The rise of Rome as a Mediterranean power created challenges that the Hellenistic kingdoms proved incapable of meeting effectively, as their continued conflicts with each other prevented the type of coordinated resistance that might have preserved their independence. The Roman military system's flexibility and organizational efficiency provided significant advantages over Hellenistic armies that had become increasingly rigid in their tactical approaches, while losing much of the innovative thinking that had characterized Alexander's campaigns. The Roman political system's capacity for absorbing defeated enemies and integrating conquered territories also proved superior to Hellenistic methods that relied primarily on military occupation and tribute extraction. The Second Macedonian War demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of traditional Macedonian military techniques and their ultimate inadequacy when confronted by Roman tactical innovations and strategic persistence. Philip V's initial successes against Roman forces revealed that Hellenistic armies retained considerable combat capabilities when properly led and deployed in favorable terrain. However, the Roman victory at Cynocephaly in 197 BCE exposed the fundamental weaknesses of phalanx formations when confronted by the flexible manipular system that allowed Roman commanders to exploit gaps and coordinate attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The Syrian War between Rome and Antiochus III represented the Seleucid Empire's final attempt to maintain its position as a major power, while demonstrating the impossibility of successful resistance to Roman expansion without fundamental changes in Hellenistic military and political organization. Antiochus's invasion of Greece, intended to exploit Roman involvement in other conflicts while rallying Greek opposition to Roman domination, instead provided Rome with justification for direct intervention in Asian affairs. The decisive Roman victory at Magnesia in 190 BCE, achieved through superior tactical coordination and the effective use of allied forces, eliminated Seleucid power west of the Taurus Mountains while establishing Roman hegemony throughout the eastern Mediterranean region. The Third Macedonian War marked the final confrontation between traditional Macedonian military power and Roman tactical innovation, as Perdiccas attempted to restore his kingdom's independence through alliance with other Hellenistic rulers and exploitation of Roman political difficulties. The war's initial phases revealed continued Macedonian military effectiveness, as Perdiccas achieved several tactical victories that demonstrated the phalanx's continued utility when properly employed in suitable terrain. However, the systematic Roman approach to the conflict, involving careful preparation, superior logistics, and coordinated pressure from multiple directions, gradually eliminated Macedonian advantages while exposing the kingdom's fundamental strategic weaknesses. The Battle of Pydna on June 22, 168 BCE, represented both the culmination of centuries of military development and the definitive end of Macedonian political independence, as Lucius Aemilius Paulus employed tactical innovations that neutralized traditional phalanx advantages while exploiting the formation's inherent limitations. The battle began with a traditional phalanx advance that initially achieved considerable success against Roman forward positions, demonstrating that Macedonian military techniques retained their effectiveness under appropriate conditions. However, the rough terrain that characterized the battlefield created gaps in the phalanx formation that Roman maniples could exploit through their superior flexibility and individual unit autonomy. The collapse of the Macedonian phalanx at Pydna occurred when Roman forces penetrated the formation's flanks and rear, creating the type of multi-directional combat that the rigid phalanx system could not handle effectively. The systematic destruction of Macedonian resistance that followed revealed both the tactical superiority of Roman military organization and the psychological impact of decisive defeat on forces that had maintained their confidence in traditional methods. Perseus' flight from the battlefield and subsequent capture marked the end of the Antigonid dynasty, while providing Rome with control over the strategic territories that had served as foundation of Macedonian power for over 4 centuries. The administrative settlement that followed Pydna reflected Roman understanding of the political challenges involved in governing territories with strong traditions of independence, while preventing the emergence of new centers of resistance to Roman authority. The division of Macedonia into 4 separate republics eliminated the unified command structure that had enabled coordinated resistance, while preserving local administrative traditions that could maintain stability without requiring extensive Roman military occupation. The prohibition on intermarriage between the different republics and restrictions on commercial relationships were designed to prevent the gradual reunification that might recreate threats to Roman security. The final dissolution of Macedonian independence occurred in 146 BCE, following the Fourth Macedonian War, when Andriscus, claiming to be Perseus' son, attempted to restore the kingdom through popular uprisings supported by Thracian military assistance. The rebellion's initial success demonstrated continued Macedonian resistance to Roman rule, while revealing the limitations of the administrative arrangements established after Pydna. However, the systematic Roman suppression of the revolt, culminating in Andriscus' defeat and capture, eliminated the last vestiges of Macedonian political autonomy while establishing direct Roman provincial administration throughout the region. The transformation of Macedonia into a Roman province marked the definitive end of the political entity that had created the largest empire in ancient history, while establishing precedents for Roman administration of eastern territories that would influence imperial policy for centuries. The systematic exploitation of Macedonian mineral resources, particularly the gold and silver mines that had provided the economic foundation for Philip's and Alexander's military innovations, demonstrated Roman understanding of the economic factors that had sustained Macedonian power, while ensuring that these resources would serve Roman rather than local interests. The cultural and intellectual legacy of the Macedonian Empire continued to influence Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilization long after the extinction of political independence, as the Hellenistic kingdoms preserved and transmitted Greek learning while facilitating cultural exchanges that enriched the entire ancient world. The libraries of Alexandria and Pergamon, the philosophical schools of Athens and Rhodes, and the artistic workshops of Antioch and Seleucia maintained traditions of intellectual inquiry and creative expression that would eventually be absorbed into Roman culture while influencing the development of Christian theology and Islamic philosophy. The military innovations pioneered by Philip II and perfected by Alexander established tactical principles and organizational methods that influenced warfare throughout the ancient world while providing models for later military developments. The integration of different military specialties into coordinated battlefield systems, the systematic use of siege warfare techniques, and the development of logistical capabilities for sustained operations across vast distances created precedents that would be studied and adapted by military commanders for centuries. The Macedonian example demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of military power as a tool for political unification, while revealing the cultural and administrative challenges involved in governing diverse populations across enormous territories. The ultimate fragmentation of Alexander's empire into competing Hellenistic kingdoms, followed by their gradual absorption into the Roman Empire, illustrated both the achievements and limitations of personal monarchy as a system for governing complex societies. The extraordinary military and political accomplishments of Philip and Alexander created temporary unity across territories that had never before been subject to unified control, while their administrative innovations provided models for imperial governance that influenced subsequent political development throughout the Mediterranean world. However, the empire's dependence on exceptional individual leadership and its failure to develop institutional mechanisms for managing succession and territorial administration ensured that its political unity would not survive the death of its founder. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from this fragmentation preserved important elements of Macedonian administrative and military practice, while adapting these traditions to local conditions and cultural requirements, creating a diverse but interconnected world that would serve as the foundation for Roman imperial expansion and the eventual development of Byzantine and Islamic civilization. Thank you for listening to the whole story. If you like my channel, like and subscribe.